Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of our viewing audience, and good afternoon also to our panelists. Welcome to our discussion on the contribution of women to disaster risk management, disaster risk reduction. In using the term disaster risk reduction, we have allowed ourselves a little leeway because we have included any aspect of disaster risk management, but also climate change adaptation. So our panelists may speak to a variety of those topics within the DRM sphere. I'm truly delighted to host this event on behalf of the University of the West Indies' Disaster Risk Reduction Center on this International Day for Disaster Reduction. It gives us an opportunity not only to balance the narrative on women and disaster risk management, but also to highlight some of the contributions which they have made. Women have contributed to disaster risk management in the Caribbean from regional level at the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, CDEMA, to the national level as national disaster coordinators, to the community level. Women head many, I would say the majority, of our community-based disaster risk management teams. They make up the majority of our shelter managers. Women have also distinguished themselves in the fields of seismology, hydrology, volcanology, emergency medicine, public health, climate science, all of which, of course, contribute to disaster risk reduction. Ladies and gentlemen, you will realize that this topic could easily occupy a 4-day conference. We have 4 hours, so we've had to be selective in our presentations. So the method we have used is to ask our panelists to speak to different thematic areas, if you will. So we have policy, we have practice, we have academia, research, professional development, we have aspects of volunteerism and agriculture. And our panelists will speak from their experiences in these different areas. We have a distinguished panel and a moderator who will guide us through this afternoon. Our moderator is Dr. Patricia Northover, who is a graduate of Cambridge University and the University of the West Indies. She is a development economist and an economic philosopher. Pat is also a film producer, having co-produced 2 films on the sugar industry in Jamaica. So you can see that she is a person of many parts and hats. Her research interests are food systems and decolonial knowledge for sustainable development. So I'm going to hand you over now to Dr. Northover.
Thank you, Barbara. Welcome everyone to this very important symposium being launched to celebrate Women in Disaster Risk Reduction in the Caribbean and International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction 2020. This virtual forum is being organized by the Disaster Risk Reduction Center and is being very ably led by Dr. Barbara Kirby. Dr. Kirby is a former Director General of the Jamaica Office of Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Management, ODPEM, a position that she held for over 10 years. So she is leading from a wealth of experience. And while she was at ODPEM, she's credited for placing risk reduction on Jamaica's national agenda and pioneering the development of a national mitigation policy. She's blushing. She also expanded the hazard mapping program and fostered the use of hazard maps by parish councils in their development planning. So she laid the groundwork for being prepared in the context of extreme climate events and climate variability. Dr. Kirby has continued to work on several disaster management programs locally, regionally, and internationally. and she has served voluntarily with the United Nations and regional organizations. In fact, she was one of the experts selected to the United Nations Scientific and Technical Committee of the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction, and is a member of the advisory board for the UN Central Emergency Response Fund. I could go on, but I just wanted to put in context that we have leadership at the front in terms of the organization of this symposium. I just wanted to set some ground rules that what I'll be doing today is facilitating a discussion in which we'll have two presenters in each session, and we'll then have a question and answer session of between 10 and 15 minutes. Each presenter will be given approximately 15 minutes to speak to their topic. I now wish to introduce our first two speakers. Our first speaker will be Dr. Deborah Villarroel-Lamb, and Dr. Lamb is a lecturer in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, Trinidad. Her current research is focused on numerical modeling of coastal processes that are linked to coastal morphology and the improvement of the design and assessment of green and gray coastal structures. Hazard assessment and mitigation are also areas of her research that she engages in. Dr. Lamb will speak to the topic, Developing the Next Generation of Disaster Risk Management and Disaster Risk Reduction Leaders. Our second speaker in our first panel will be Ms. Claire Bernard. She is the Director of the Sustainable Development and Regional Planning at the Planning Institute of Jamaica. Her topic will be Women in Disaster Risk Reduction, a Policy Perspective. I now wish to turn over the floor to Dr. Lamb.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Let me just get ready to share my screen here. I have a short PowerPoint presentation to share with you all today. Okay. All right, so today we're celebrating the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction, and my talk will focus on really and truly how do we train and develop leaders in this field, in this particular area. I've been already introduced by Dr. Northover, thank you very much. And yes, I'm a lecturer in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. I'm a civil engineer by training, and my research focused in the area of coastal engineering subsequently. And so that is where I sort of ended up. But I have also delved in the areas of natural hazards and disaster mitigation, and that was part of the training that I would have engaged in at the university in my first few years at university as an academic. Yeah. So what will I talk about? Basically, I will have three main components that I will be discussing today, just about increasing awareness, really and truly, who do we want involved in disaster risk management and mitigation? What does training and development look like? What is required in order for us to create these leaders who can help our region move forward and propel into an area where we are sustainable and prepared for disasters? And of course, disaster management is not an isolated event. We do need a team effort. It's a collective approach. So I'll just focus on some advantages and disadvantages of those. Right, so we'll begin. Who do we want? This is about increasing awareness. And one of the things we've focused on regionally, and we've always done that, is increasing the awareness in the public sector. So we do have the advertisements, the marketing campaigns, when we have hurricanes or seismic events in the region, and we have always tried to educate our public. But there's an element that is missing that we also need to focus on, and one would think that having technical experts being educated in the field may seem a little bit odd, but we do have technical persons who don't understand that they have a key role in moving the disaster mitigation strategies forward in the region. And it could come from a diverse area of sectors, not only engineers, mathematicians, managers, but even musicians, poets. So we can have an engagement across a range of sectors, and it's trying to get these persons who are able to be engaged in the process. And that is who we want. And again, as a side to that, we also want to ensure that we are engaging both public and private sector entities, because they have to work together to ensure that we are able to drive change. Because the public sector agencies are able to maybe procure a lot more funding and acquire a little bit more money to move research and ideas forward. But we also need the private sector involved, because they also have a role in terms of facilitating, let's say, data collection activities or community exercises. So there's a role for everyone. And it's trying to ensure that we have this idea permeating throughout our society. One of the things that I realized when I started teaching at the university a couple of years ago in terms of natural hazards was that there was a perception that the field is a very non-technical field. And I was very surprised at that, because I had these young engineers that I was talking to, and they didn't think disaster management and hazard assessment was something that was very technical. But I tried to demonstrate to our students that this field is a very intricate field. There's a lot of science involved with it, a lot of maths, a lot of physics, and the perception that it is a non-technical field was moving people away from coming into the area. And I think we have to change that view. People always tend to be focused on a disaster when it happens. So we sort of are event orientated. We look at mobilizing funds when something has happened. But we need to, again, change the mindset and let everyone be aware this is something we are constantly working towards, even if it's developing new ideas, and even if we don't have a disaster, even if it's looking at putting in mitigation strategies in place. So these are things that we have to take into consideration all year round. So from operation, as a civil engineer, I can speak through from design through to operation of our structures, and of course monitoring and introducing preventative measures and strategies while the structure or the design is in operation. And of course, we want to ensure that we have a diverse group of people coming from all genders, all classes and areas of our society. My experience in the undergraduate classes at the engineering faculties, they tend to be about 50-50 in terms of male, female inside of the classes. So I don't see a bias in terms of there's one group more than the other, but I hope that that will continue, and I'm not sure if it's reflected in a practical sense, and I hope some of the other panelists will talk to that. But from the training perspective, we do see the same sort of interest between our male and female students in the natural hazards arena. So then what we moving on to now is, what does that training and development look like? And of course, at the top of it, as an academic, we look at accessing and engaging in state-of-the-art research. That is important, but not outside of our region. I'm talking about engaging in this research within our own region, not relying on external entities to help us decide on what is the best thing for us to use, what is best for where we are. And I think that is important. I've always advocated the role of regional persons solving our problems. So it's accessing that sort of state-of-art research and using the latest technology in our systems, in our designs, in our solutions. But then we also have to be mindful that something that may be applicable to a first world nation, even though I don't like that word, to places like in Europe and in the US, it may not be applicable to us here in the region. So we do have some constraints. So I can give you an example that I have trying to resolve at the moment. So I am in the coastal arena at this particular point in time, focused on that area in my research. And we're trying to set up, or we have set up, a video camera system. And the camera system will serve sort of like a warning system when we have erosive events on the coastline, high erosion taking place on the coastline. But one of the limitations is accessing the quality internet access on the coastal regions. And while other locations worldwide might say, okay, we could use 4G, I don't have that sort of access to that cellular network on our coastline. So it has become a limitation. So we have to find a workaround. We have to work with our constraints. And we don't have to see these constraints as hurdles where we feel they're insurmountable. But of course, we try to overcome and find solutions that are beneficial to us in the region. Of course, the relevant training means that we have to ensure we use what we have. So knowing what we have is important, not just knowing the constraints, but what do we have to use, and implementing that in our solutions, implementing that in our decisions. So if it is I have to use a fisherman to help me get some wave data, I will ask the fisherman to help me get some wave data. If it is I have mangroves or seagrass beds on a site, maybe I can include that in my solution on my coastline. So I use what I have. And that is important. And that has to be part of the training for our leaders of the future, learning how to overcome problems, finding solutions in spite of the overwhelming difficulties you might have in terms of funding, access to the same state-of-the-art research and tools and technology. And of course, finding a way to engage both the public and private sector entities to support our training initiatives, to create opportunities for training, because with everything, we do need funding to procure tools, procurement of equipment. So of course, we do need that support financially, but we also have persons who have expertise, experience that they can impart to our students, impart to our leaders, our new generation of disaster risk managers. And so that they don't make the same mistakes, but rather build and learn and grow. And we do need a space for everybody. So of course, we have to now sensitize those new managers to how they have to play a part in the whole aspect. They have a role, but they're not the only persons in the game. So we have to include that sort of training where they have to identify there's a space for everybody, and we work in an interdisciplinary capacity. And that is how I'm going to end, just talking a little bit about that interdisciplinary approach, which is critical for moving forward as a future in the region for our leaders. And I just want to contrast what I mean, or just distinguish clearly what I mean by this interdisciplinary approach. So traditionally, we tend to work in our own disciplines. I'm an engineer, I work in my civil engineering field, and I may talk to you, but I know what I'm doing. So this is this interdisciplinary approach where we don't really have much interaction. But in order for us to train our future leaders, they have to understand natural hazards and natural hazard mitigation strategies are going to emanate from a cross-disciplinary approach. And that could take different levels. It could be someone at a multidisciplinary, which is one of the lower levels, to a transdisciplinary approach, all right? But I'm going to focus just on the interdisciplinary one, which is basically a more practical approach to working in a team, working across disciplines. We're trying to integrate knowledge and different methods, trying to find real solutions, practical solutions that can satisfy across the various disciplines and synthesize, collate all the given aspects of what we're trying to solve. So we all have a goal, we all have a focus, and we're involving not only technical persons, but non-technical persons as well, from start to finish of the project. And that will produce an optimal solution. When we have a problem, all hands on deck, we all know what we want, we all know what we're trying to achieve, and then we all bring our own areas of expertise to solve the problem. So this is the interdisciplinary approach I'm talking about. And we have to let our future leaders know that they must work together, because it's not about me deciding, I know a concrete wall could work here, but that doesn't mean it's the best solution. What about the ecosystems? What about the social considerations? So optimizing doesn't necessarily mean in terms of technical aspects, and if I'm looking as an engineer only, but it's everyone, and we have to consider those social aspects if we have to produce a sustainable design. So this is the key underlying the future generations, and we have all the other aspects we need to consider, but we must be able to incorporate into our training and development a mechanism by which our undergraduates, our graduates, our future leaders can understand that we're working in an interdisciplinary team. We're going to share certain values. We're going to have problems, but we're going to have some advantages to doing this kind of approach. So I'm going to just identify some of the pluses and some of the negatives to working in an interdisciplinary team, working as this kind of approach for natural disaster mitigation. So just some brief benefits. I'm not attempting to be exhaustive here or go through everything, but just some ideas just to throw out there so we can discuss. So some of the benefits of working in this kind of manner is, of course, we don't have a fragmented approach to solving the problem. It's not like I come up with a set of designs as an engineer and then I hand them over to someone else, and then I have to come back and iterate, and it may not be very efficient in that way. So it's not this fragmented analysis. So we can work as a team and have a clear single direction. Of course, it encourages a more collaborative approach to decision making, and therefore we become more efficient. We have more effective solution, more effective execution of our goals of the project. While there is a space for collaboration, there's also a space for individual expertise, because as an engineer, I still have a role. I still have to do the engineering components. And we need to ensure that while we're in this interdisciplinary team, that we don't lose that rigorous approach to doing our own field. It's not a matter of becoming lost in the collaborative approach, but we still have a dedicated set of skills and knowledge that we can bring to the team, and we have to maintain that rigorous approach. But in working with the team, we can promote or transform the way we do things. So by talking to a social scientist or talking to an ecologist, I come up with different ideas. So I foster more creative and innovative ideas. And so we can transform the way we do things across the region. And it's not just what traditionally has been done, but what we can do in the future. And most importantly, if we're working in an interdisciplinary team, it means we're already learning each other's language. So I can converse better with the ecologists, I can converse better with the managers or the people in the management field or the social scientists. So when we do that, that means we are able to disseminate our ideas and knowledge more effectively at the end of the project, because we already have a common language, so the public can better understand what it is the project is trying to achieve, what the team is trying to do. And this is idealistic, but of course there are some negatives to trying to work in a team. And I think that is why it's a little bit difficult, because we see people on this sort of interdisciplinary team as if they are not specialized. But we must create the linkages between the disciplines, but not lose that speciality, that niche that we have acquired. As I alluded to, one of the problems is that there are pronounced differences in how we perceive things, how we perceive problems. So natural scientists approach a problem very differently to applied scientists, but that is what it is now. But that is not how we perceive the future to be, or what we hope for the future. Because if we can integrate these ideas and new way of thinking in our training and development, we can lose some of that differences. We can try to bridge the gap between the various disciplines in disaster management. And again, that would include looking at understanding what you're saying in terms of terminology, and what I mean by I don't know, probability of failure of a structure might mean something very differently to you, but we have to be able to transfer that knowledge. And of course, there's the attendant problems of working in any group. There are different personalities, there are different people who want to participate at various levels in a team, and we have to resolve those. So working in a team, while we try to train our students to do those things, it still is something that you learn and you develop as you move out into your professional career, and we still have to continue to foster that in our training and development. Okay, so I am going to conclude now. I just want to emphasize that, of course, the education is important. It is critical, but I also want to understand it's not just education for people who are non-technical, but for persons who are in the technical field. It's just maybe not in a field that traditionally has been involved in disaster management and mitigation, and ensuring that they are aware that there is a role and a part for them to play. And then we have to ensure that whoever is involved in the training of our future leaders, that the training is relevant, it is appropriate, and it is cooperative. And we have to find a way to ensure that when we train the leaders, they're able to step out into society and work as a team with other people across the various disciplines, so that they could solve our problems regionally And in so doing, hopefully we are able to drive some holistic change across our region. Right? So thank you very much for listening.
Excellent presentation, wonderful. Asking us to go beyond our traditional disciplinary perspectives as a development economist. That's par for the course, which allows us to engage in interdisciplinary and then transdisciplinary thinking. So wonderful presentation. I'd now like to ask Ms. Claire Bernard, who is a senior person involved in sustainable development for several decades. And I just wish her to now present her talk on women in disaster risk reduction, a policy perspective. Ms. Bernard, the floor is now yours. I think your mic is...
I'm muted, so I'd have to share again. I'm sorry about that.
That's fine. These issues will come up. Okay, we're seeing your slide.
I told my colleague that I'm nervous. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. I just want to start by associating with a statement made by the former Deputy Executive Director of UN Women, and he's also the current head of the Green Climate Fund. That's Mr. Yannick Glenmarek. And he said that women are not just a vulnerable group, they're also agents of change. I believe that he was speaking from a position where he had seen women really change the landscape for better in many facets of life. And I'm thinking chances are he had met and worked with some of the formidable women who work in DRM in Jamaica and the wider Caribbean region. And I want to use this opportunity to recognize some of the women who have helped us here in the Planning Institute to really focus on this area of work, and also some of the women in the Planning Institute of Jamaica who have helped to advance the DRM agenda. So Dr. Kirby, please don't blush, but I want to recognize you. I also want to recognize my colleague, Barbara Scott, who really works very hard at getting the DRM issue into the agenda for financing. My colleague, Nadine Brown here, who leads the DRM portfolio, Marika Brown, who does work for women, the team at ODPEM, and some of the female consultants we've worked with, including Eleanor Jones. So in my presentation today, I'm not really going to be singling out women. I just really want to tell you how in the Planning Institute of Jamaica, as a policy organization, we try to incorporate women. And so I've organized the presentation in looking at women in disaster, really just to emphasize how we see it, disasters impacting women, to talk about some of the policy issues, some of the relevant agreements that we take into consideration, some of the local policies and strategies, how the PIOJ tries to influence the agenda, and what are some opportunities that we see. So we're going to start by accepting what the literature tells us, that women often suffer higher rates of mortality, morbidity, etc., and significant damage to their livelihoods than men in disasters. I'm going to accept also that the vulnerability of women as a group in disasters is compounded by their role as caregivers, and that is the role they play in the family, as well as the predominance of women in nurturing occupations such as females and so on, such as teaching and nursing. I did say that I'm very nervous. I'm going to use 3 examples, 2 of different types of disasters, to underline the last point I made. I start by looking at the COVID pandemic to date, And the number I'm going to use is a little different from the one on screen. But as at yesterday, we had 3,512 males who had contracted the virus in Jamaica, compared to 4,274 women. There are more deaths among men than women, but I want to suggest that notwithstanding all of that, the impact has been really greater for women. So I look at the Survey of Living Conditions, the latest published data, and we see that women account for 45.2% of female-headed households, account for 45.2% of all households. A third of the children in the country live in female-headed households. At least one child lives in those kinds of households. And on top of that, 9% of persons 65 and over live in female-headed households. And then we look at the adult dependency ratio, and we see that for every 100 women employed in the working age group, there are 62.3 who are dependent on her. So I use that just to say that although we're looking at, say, fewer deaths in COVID, if you look at the impact in terms of the burden on the female, it is that much greater. I also look at the 2017 flood rains, and to say that apart from farmers as a group, and you know that roughly 30% of farmers are women, and women play a great role in marketing, produce, and all of that, that most of the persons who were assessed for assistance were women. 69% were women and children. And on top of that, we had 16% who were elderly persons. And again, if you think of the role that women play in disasters, you understand how much the burden is increased. And I look a little further back at the Riverton City fire. That was a pollution event. And there, I don't know if you remember, for over 2 weeks, the life in the city of Kingston and adjoining parishes was disrupted by the impact of the fire. There was a very wide zone of influence, which I share on the screen. The important thing is that most of those who lived in that red area, this very red area, were women. And most of those who lived in the not so red area were women. Essentially, what I'm suggesting is that, again, most of those impacted, and because a lot of those areas are poor areas as well, the women were burdened, not just for themselves, but for the children and for the elderly who depend on them. And so when I look at things, how does that relate to the work of the PIOJ? Well, as I said before, we're policy planners, and so we have to be taking note of these kinds of experiences, whether the information comes to us qualitatively from persons who have experienced them or from research that has been undertaken. And we depend a lot on the participatory planning approach because we're influenced by the consultation code of practice, which tells us that consultation of the citizenry is very important to the work we do. Our former Director General of the PIOJ also emphasized for us that by bringing people into the planning process, we're giving them agency, and that way we're helping them to help themselves. And so the work we do in terms of women and DRR also pulls from a range of policy areas represented by things like the SDG, and I'm talking in more recent times. So we're looking at the Sustainable Development Agenda and the SDGs. I think there are over 20 targets in the SDG that specifically talk about women. We're looking in terms of disasters, we're looking at goal 13, which is talking about climate change. But there are related issues when we look at life on land, life below the sea, when we look at things like cities and so on. So of course we take, we go to agreements like the Paris Agreement to see what they're talking about. The Sendai framework, which in priority 4 talks about enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response. And here too, there was an emphasis on vulnerable groups like women, and so on and so forth. So we ensure that the work we are doing in terms of advancing the agenda to address the issues that is put before us is not just one that we're just taking from our own experiences, but we're looking at the international perspective, the experiences of other countries, proposals that are being made, and so on. In terms of some local policies that we that are relevant to our work as well. Oh, you're advancing the slide. We're looking at Vision 2030, and most persons here would have some exposure to Vision 2030, the National Development Plan. The medium-term framework, 2018-2021, also directs us in terms of the work we are to do with respect to achieving outcome 14, climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. We're looking at the gender policy, the climate change policy framework, and we have a communications plan to deal with climate resilience. The poverty program identifies the nexus between women or gender and the issues relating to disaster impact, or social protection strategy also provides. So I just listed a number of these policies and strategy areas, and more critically, and I want to thank Dr. Kirby here as well, because she was the one who directed us into doing more deliberate socioeconomic environmental impact assessment of disasters. And here we got help from ECLA to develop a handbook that assists us in doing that work. Okay.
Thank you so much for your presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Do you want to say any final words?
Okay, just to say that there are a number of ways in which the PIOJ influences the process. We do that through agenda setting. We do that through policy review. We have agenda desk. We are helping to identify and ensure that the issue is incorporated into the development agendas with our development partners to ensure that we have funding. And there are a number of opportunities, but they are listed in the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bernard and Ms. Lam. Very important presentations overviewing the role of the Planning Institute in integrating disaster risk reduction in our development policy, strategy, and planning frameworks, as well as showing us the differential risk impact of these disasters on women, drawing on a couple of examples from Jamaica. I now wish to turn open the floor for question and answer. We have a very wonderful set of participants. Welcome to our international tour or local forum. And we are hoping to be able to field your questions. A question being directed from Ms. Joy Grant, Joan Joy Grant Cummins, to Ms. Claire Bernard. She would like to get a copy of the Riverton City dump fire that you mentioned, impact on women and girls, as one of the takeaways for your presentation. And just would like to encourage you to post your questions so that we can have a lively exchange in terms of the interchange between ourselves and the presenters. Ms. Lam certainly had a wonderful set of perspectives, encouraging us to focus on breaking down silos and working together for a cohesive and integrated approach. And Ms. Bernard is highlighting some of the international dynamics, the agreements that have been put in place to guide and support our national development long-term planning project, which is guided by Vision 2030. One of the issues I felt coming out of the presentations had to do with the ways in which the training in disaster risk and management is perceived as a technical area, and how that may dissuade individuals from entering into that field. And I'm wondering what sorts of approaches we could take in terms of raising awareness, a gender-sensitive approach to building awareness to disaster risk reduction from the university. Is there anything that perhaps we could do better in terms of demystifying what goes on in disaster risk reduction training? Ms. Lam? Dr. Lam, sorry. Could you unmute your mic?
Sure, no problem. One of the key areas that I wanted to highlight is of course just trying to train from as early on. So it is providing that information, because like in the civil engineering department, the natural hazards course that I was a part of a couple of years ago, students only had it as an option. So it was an optional course at the time. It became afterwards a compulsory course, but again, they were only introduced it in their final year. So the perception had come in from the time they entered the university. So they entered the university with that perception. So the key here is we have to start exposing them to the aspects, the technical aspects of disaster mitigation and hazard management from in our secondary schools. I think that is one of the ways we need to approach it and let them understand the holistic approach to doing it. In my experience, a number of the students felt it was more of a talk, it's about talking about a problem and, doing the same things over again. But I wanted to bring to bear while I was doing the course that it was a rigorous field. There was a lot of statistics, a lot of probability, a lot of hardcore of technical work that goes into mitigation of disasters. And I think it will take some time to move through the generations, but we do have to start from a little bit younger, entering the schools. And in order to gain that diversity, of course, we do have, at least in Trinidad, a lot of all female, all male schools, some of the co-educational settings, but making sure that we educate across the spectrum. So they are aware of the aspects of disaster management and not just focusing only on one particular group or one particular gender of persons.
Thank you for that comment. I just wanted to follow up, Dr. Lam, on one of the questions coming from the audience, from Simone Lee. She's asking, could you give any examples of how interdisciplinary approach has helped to convey your message to the general public?
So the question, if I understand the question, it's referring to if I have some experience where an interdisciplinary approach will help in terms of public awareness and public engagement. Well, I have been part of, when I say part of, took part in a number of stakeholder engagements. And one of I can tell you where it didn't work quite a lot of times, because we do have, particularly when we presenting engineering solutions to communities, a lot of the times the community groups are not quite aware of the aspects of the solution. So, for example, we're presenting a coastal engineering problem at a site on the east coast of Trinidad. And when we're sitting in the stakeholder engagement, they were not aware of some of the terminology, understanding what the solution can do. So I have not seen it work the way that I envision it to work, or that I hope it would work, but I have seen it broken down many times because of that lack of ability to communicate the ideas effectively to various community groups. And in that particular case, the incident I'm remembering, I remember the fishing community kept asking particular questions and indicating that, they were being adversely affected by the proposed solution. And I felt that we needed to do more as engineers, at least as part of the team, to ensure that we didn't have that problem. So you now have a solution that was being presented, and the community that was going to be affected by the proposed solution were not happy with the proposed solution, nor were they aware of the benefits that the solution can have in their community. So there was a clear disconnect with what should have taken place. And that is where I hope that if we can engage these groups from early on, and we can work across various teams, and in these slides I mentioned not only technical but non-technical persons as well, what it would mean by the time we get to the stage where we have a solution, we wouldn't have those issues, because the stakeholder engagement tends to be the engineers or whoever work on the project, and then they present it to the various groups, and then there's a lot of feedback, and that is not an efficient means by which it should operate. So that is where the interdisciplinary approach was something that I want to advocate, and it starts with training, because we train in isolation basically as engineers and in different areas. And I know for engineering we have a lot technical work that we have to get across to our students as well as to learn. But we do have to find a place to integrate those additional aspects so that it works better when we move it out into practice. I don't know if that answers your question. I hope it does.
Much. I wanted to field a question to Ms. Bernard in relationship to the issues of financing for disaster risk reduction. In your introduction, you highlighted, for example, Mrs. Barbara Scott's strong advocacy for trying to get disaster risk reduction on the agenda of finance. And what are some of the challenges that the Planning Institute faces in trying to carry out its very broad mandate for both a consultative approach and an empowerment approach, integrating communities and various stakeholders into discussion? What are some of the challenges that the Planning Institute faces in trying to deliver on that mandate in terms of access to finance?
Okay, well, I don't know that it's a mandate per se of the PIOG to specifically go after financing for disaster risk management. We have, however, with the guidance, as I said before, of persons like Dr. Kirby and the work that we've been doing in identifying the negative impact of disasters on the overall viability of the state, we have been pushing that agenda both to the Ministry of Finance and with our development partners. And from that perspective, even having done impact assessment since 2002, once there is any major event, we have pulled a team together and conducted disaster impact assessment. And we're able to show the impact of whatever disaster on GDP. And so that we've been able to show those persons who are responsible for the purse string that the country's growth is being significantly impaired by the negative impact of disasters. And so we've been advocating a resilience building approach. And as a result of which the Ministry of Finance, for example, has developed a disaster risk financing policy. They've gone more into contingency planning, and we've even entered into a contingent credit facility with one of the development partners. And with that, Ms. Scott brings it into the agenda to try to get it on the country program with agencies like the IDB, the World Bank, the European Union, and so on.
Excellent. Thank you for your response. I'm not sure if there's anyone here who would be able to field this question. It's from Vanya David. Maybe it's related to Ms. Lam. It's a generic question on training in relationship to warehouse management and retail distribution. So is that it? Does that stretch you in terms of your interdisciplinary approach to disaster risk management training?
Yes, it does. But I will take a stab at it because for one of the things I think the question is asking in terms of relief efforts subsequently after we've had a disastrous event. Of course, we looking at construction, that's where I can take that slant in terms of that civil engineering slant. So we have to design structures, one that are able to house the necessary items, that's the warehousing. There are various software tools and technology that you can use for managing your resources within a warehouse capacity or warehouse setting. Ensuring that you don't have loss of items. If you need cold storage facilities, there are considerations to various structural elements that we can discuss in terms of warehouse management and in terms of disaster risk and disaster reduction. But I'm not sure if I don't know if the question is asking if we train specifically at the civil engineering department to do those things, but our graduates do have exposure to various types of projects. Just in the recent years, one of the projects they would have designed is, of course, a warehouse for in this particular case, was a port facility. So we do expose them to diverse projects, but there are no specialized training in terms of warehouse management and those strategies. And they do learn some of the available technology in their final year while they execute if they pursue that particular project for their design. So I'm not sure if that helps in any way, but I hope it does.
Well, I think you did very well to take that was a bouncer and you fielded it very well. I don't know if you wanted to spend maybe 5 minutes just asking questions of each other's presenters in your different capacities. Miss Bernard and Miss Lam, just a brief engagement on issues related to the importance of increasing the levels of awareness, developing the interdisciplinary approaches, and also being able to have that broad stakeholder approach in disaster risk reduction to train a new generation of leaders. If there are any questions that you wanted to field to each other.
I could ask Dr. Lam how she sees, so she's recommending an interdisciplinary approach, and I'm just wondering how she sees it being managed and coordinated, for want of a better word.
Well, I could see most importantly, I believe it begins with the training and changing the mindset. And I think we still have a little bit of work to do in that area. But once there is a view that I am part of something bigger, I'm hoping that a lot of the issues that are associated with those negative aspects of the interdisciplinary approach will hopefully be resolved. So our language is not just we don't understand each other, but I am willing to learn, I'm willing to listen, and people from a variety of fields can provide ideas. So I have spoken with persons who were from in the music setting or in poetry, and they ask questions about, let's say, coastal engineering, and they put forward solutions, and they say, do you think this could work? And it provides that kind of creative space. So at the moment, what I see happening is we first have to have that change of mindset, and we cannot assume we're not going to have any problems. But I'm thinking that if we get together in a virtual space or in an actual setting, and we decide this is what we want to achieve, then in spite of all the difficulties, we can work towards achieving that goal. So there'll be a lot of discussion, there'll be a lot of conflict, no disagreement there, that's expected. But there must be someone within that team who is able to resolve the conflict. There's somebody who has to be able to drive it. So in order for it to work, I think what is essential at this juncture is finding that critical leader, that role that person must take in guiding the interdisciplinary team through conflict resolution, mediation, and a little bit of translation when needs be, to ensure that that continues and there's progression taking place, as opposed to it just being stalled because this one didn't like the idea that the other one has. So at the moment, I think practically how that will be executed is having a real independent role or team leader. That person is critical for the interdisciplinary team to function. And then that person has to be able to mediate as well as resolve conflict. So in a practical sense, I think that is the key element for moving forward that interdisciplinary type of setting.
Okay, thank you so much. I wanted to open the floor for additional questions that you may have, and considering the PowerPoint presentations that were provided by our two speakers. So if there are any other comments or questions, please do let us know. If not, then I'd like to thank our two presenters for their fantastic contribution, and allow us to have perhaps gained some time to move to our next panel and discuss the additional concerns that we want to go through in this symposium.
Madam,
okay, so there is a question. Sorry, Miss.
May I just say that someone had asked about access to the report, the Riverton City Fire report. There is a whole folder of impact assessments on the PIOJ website, and it includes even an assessment of the Tivoli problem in 2010. So they could find it at pioj.gov.gm. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for providing that information. Ms. Berada, I don't know if you had any other comments that you wanted to provide rooted on your discussion in your PowerPoint, or any comments generally in relationship to your thematic that you focused on today, which was the women in disaster risk reduction from a policy perspective?
I'm thinking that we have some opportunities to improve the quality of the work we are doing. Definitely there is the opportunity for further research. There is the whole question of the development of the comprehensive disaster risk management policy that we're working with the IDB, and that should be coming out for discussion soon. And we're hoping that women will also use the opportunity to comment on how they see their role in DRM and how what is being done can help to improve their lot. Of course, there is the opportunity for further gender-sensitive analysis, and to have the PIOJ, the gender desk, pay some more attention to the issue of women and disaster as another area. Of course, we have all of those international agreements to report on, and I think it's also an opportunity to identify where we're lagging, and therefore to provide an opportunity for us to make up space, make up time, and improve the treatment of the area. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. Certainly we need to move ahead in terms of the development of a gender-sensitive approach. We have the overall gender policy that guides us in integrating and mainstreaming gender in all our policy discourses. And as your presentation highlighted, women have a higher rate of mortality from natural disasters, so in climate hazards and in environmental hazards such as the Riverton City fire that you mentioned. The reports are available. Certainly the concentration of the impact was felt on poor women who lived in the center of that not natural environmental hazard. Certainly that's more of a man-made hazard than an environmental hazard. I'd like to allow us to speak to another question that came in. This is from Joan Grant Cummins. She's looking at she's a comment actually. It's in relationship to the logistics program at the Caribbean Maritime Institute located in Port. I think she's making that contribution that the question before that was looking at warehouse management and relief distribution is actually being addressed through that Maritime Institute. So all our higher educational institutions are playing an important and critical role in the process of training. One final question I think is directed to Dr. Lam, and this is from Roseanne Smith. The question is, how do we engage elements of disaster risk reduction and management in the university? For example, current courses and programs, even as we think about issues related in the humanities and cultural studies such as music and art. So that's going even further in terms of trying to integrate it. Certainly, the role of the creative sector is vital for raising awareness, such as the song Wild Gilbert that was done. And it's become a landmark in terms of just being aware of the consequences of such a disaster and how to respond. So I'd leave the last question to Miss Dr. Lam.
Thank you, Chair. Just to say at the moment, what I would recommend is we need to have at least some sort of interaction with the other groups. So while I used to lecture in the natural hazards course in the engineering faculty, what I used to do was invite a number of guest lecturers to come in to give their perspective. We would go over to different faculties and different areas. Like I remember we were always by the Seismic Research Unit or some other areas. So it's a matter of bringing a different perspective even in the training. So having guest lecturers, having discussions, going out to the various sectors just to demonstrate how we can work as a team. I think at least in the interim we can do those things while we try to change a whole mindset and perspective of our new generation. So I think that should be beneficial, at least as a sort of a stopgap until we get where we need to be. Thanks.
So it just leaves me to thank our two wonderful presenters. Hopefully you'll be able to stay with us for the additional conversations that we will have, and welcome you to also field questions if you are here with us as well for the other presenters, so that we can get some of the dialogue to be amongst ourselves as women and leading professionals in the field. And show solidarity in terms of our contributions that we're making individually. I'd now like to introduce the next panel. We will have two individuals, the only male in our lineup, Professor Balfour Spence, and he is a professor of applied disasters and emergency studies in the department. He's a professor in Applied Disasters and Emergency Studies Department at Brandon University in Canada. And he will be speaking to contributions of women to disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation in Caribbean agriculture, which, as we know, is on the front burner now in response to the seismic hit of COVID-19 on our economy and the efforts to pivot to afford a greater degree of resilience and sustainability of our populations as we work through the challenges that COVID-19 has thrown up for food security and the well-being of our population. He'll be joined by Miss Hugh, who is the Deputy Director General of the Jamaica Red Cross, and she will be speaking to women as volunteers in disaster risk management. I just want to say a few words of Miss Hugh in introducing her. She is an educator, communicator, HIV and AIDS program developer, trainer and advocate, as well as motivational speaker. So she does interdisciplinarity as her way of engaging with processes of risk management in relationship to HIV AIDS programming. She is a former chairperson for the Education Subcommittee of the National AIDS Committee in Jamaica and former chair of the Red Cross Caribbean AIDS Network. She's also on a regional faculty member for the Red Cross training program. She is the recipient of a National Special Award for Jamaica's National AIDS Control Program for contributing to local and international response to HIV and AIDS. She is a well-known facilitator and master trainer par excellence then in the field of HIV prevention, treatment, care and support throughout the Caribbean, Jamaica, and has trained numerous individuals in her signature Together We Can peer education program in Delaware, Philadelphia, Virginia, Washington, D.C. in the United States. Her insight, sensitivity, and compassion has endeared her to the many vulnerable groups for whom she has advocated and with whom she interacts as she seeks consistently to empower them to make a positive change in their lives. An actress as well as a choreographer, she uses the performing arts to educate and make a dynamic impact on trainees. So I think Ms. Hugh is a living example of what interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity means. So I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Professor Spence, to make his presentation, contributions of women, to disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation in Caribbean agriculture, after which we'll have Mrs. Hugh. So Balfour, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Northover, for that kind introduction. And I take this opportunity to thank the organizers of this forum for inviting my participation. I'm honored to be the only male on this very distinguished panel. So thank you very much. I want to begin this presentation with a very broad brush comment, and that is the contribution of women to the real and potential sustainability of Caribbean agriculture, and by extension, food security of the region, is for the most part under-recognized. And secondly, that their contribution to disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation has been under acknowledged as well. In other words, these factors which play such a critical role in building and developing the resilient capacity of the region are the contribution of women in this regard is very under acknowledged and underappreciated. In this presentation, I'll set the context by looking at the profile of Caribbean agriculture. I'll look a bit at the importance of agriculture to Caribbean economies, the food security context in which this occurs, the contribution of women to sustainability of these agricultural systems, the gender equalities that exist in Caribbean agriculture, the DRRCCA contribution of women to Caribbean agriculture, and I end with a summary. Now, the context of the presentation is set within the rationale for a focus on small-scale farming, small-scale agriculture, primarily because small-scale farming remains the pillar of domestic food security and food sovereignty in the Caribbean region. Over the last 30 years or so, the macroeconomic contribution of agriculture to the economies of the region has been relatively small. For most countries, it is below 15%. But the domestic food production sector plays a critical role in the livelihood profile of the region. This happens in spite of extreme biases in land resource allocation in this sector, resulting in the all-familiar agricultural dualism in the region, where we have large-scale farmers producing primarily for an export market, while the small-scale producers are focused on production for the domestic sector, and by extension, the maintenance of our food security and sovereignty. The agricultural sector, though, is probably the most vulnerable, maybe next to tourism, vulnerable to the impact of hazards. And in the absence of a dedicated catastrophic risk transfer mechanism, the recovery of this sector lies in international support or national intervention. We also note that within this sector, the contribution of women is under-recognized. In addition to that, there's extreme gender disparity in terms of resource access by women in the agricultural sector of the Caribbean region. I'll share with you a graph which is indicating that while agriculture's percentage of GDP is relatively small, this it can be correlated. Let me put it another way. The contribution of agriculture to the macroeconomic landscape of the region is one where there is an inverse relationship between per capita GDP and the importance of the agricultural contribution. So we find that in states such as Haiti, where the per capita GDP is low, the contribution or the percentage contribution of agriculture to that GDP is fairly high. But as the per capita GDP increases, then the role of agriculture diminishes in that GDP contribution. Now, however, when we look at the role of agriculture in the livelihood profile of the region, we see a totally different scenario, where at all times, the contribution of agriculture to employment far exceeds its contribution to GDP, which is saying that a significant proportion of Caribbean peoples are depending on agriculture for their livelihood. And this is one of the reasons why there is such an urgency to ensure that the sector adapts to our changing climate and be in a position to deal with existing and future climate hazards. The point is, though, that the Caribbean's food import bill has constantly increased since the 1990s. In other words, we are importing more and more food, and we're spending more and more on the importation of food over the years. And this, in an environment of changing climate and increased climate hazard, puts our food security and our food sovereignty at risk. Women are underrepresented in agricultural employment in the Caribbean. In fact, among global regional areas, the Caribbean has the lowest representation of women in agriculture. For most Caribbean states, this is below 20%. I think for Jamaica, it's around 11%, if I remember correctly. No, sorry, 30%. In spite of their underrepresentation in agriculture, women's contribution to the food value chain is unquestionable. Firstly, women are the owners, they are the stewards of the backyard gardens which exist in most rural communities in the Caribbean region. These backyard gardens are actually the incubators for farming systems. This is where farmers are born. This is where farmers plant their first grain of pea. This is where farmers learn to be farmers. And they learn this from their mothers, because it is the mothers who tend these backyard gardens and who will take these children into these gardens. The children don't sit back and fall asleep and play. They want to get involved in whatever the mother is doing. And so it's an important training ground for farmers. Women are also the primary marketers of agricultural produce. And as a result, they are the generators of the market intelligence that is necessary to guide the production process. They are the main employers in agro-processing, and as such, are main contributors to the value-added food chain. Increasingly, they are playing a role in the extension services through their registration in agricultural training facilities. They are the managers of household finances, and by so doing, they are key decision makers in the allocation of financial resources in the agricultural sector. Throughout most of the Caribbean, the fisheries subsector is seen as a part of agriculture. And here again, we see a critical role being played by women, especially in their post-harvest activity as fishmongers and so on. But in spite of these important contributions, significant gender inequalities in the sector prevail. I mentioned their share in agricultural employment, 20 to 30% in the region. Their access to land and other productive resources, there's also a bias there. And this is a reflection of the tenurial systems of the region. RADA, for instance, indicate that only about 11% of the cultivated land in Jamaica is owned by women. Because of the bias in the tenurial system, women have less access to credit because of the lack of collateral such as land titles. And by extension, they have less access to agricultural information because the extension services tend to focus on farmers who have titles, who can show ownership of their property. The point, though, is that women will continue to play a significant role in this sector as our climates change and as we're faced with greater climate challenges. I mentioned their role as supervisors of the farm incubator. They supervise these young farmers. As such, the women are important in the transfer of disaster risk management and climate change knowledge to prospective farmers. So you probably will know the Caribbean sociology classic, My Mother Who Fathered Me. And it speaks a lot to the role of women as in fostering, in providing the foundation for the farming system. They represent this important challenge through which we can transfer the requisite knowledge for reducing disaster risk and adapting to climate change. They make significant contribution in water resource management because through their practice and transfer of water resource management skills that are critical to drought management and climate change related water deficit. They make key contribution in terms of the promotion of agrobiodiversity, species diversity, which we see in the kitchen garden and female-owned farms are greater than on male-owned farms. And they reflect a greater awareness than men of the use value of a wider variety of species. Agrobiodiversity, though, is a risk minimization strategy that enhances resilience in the face of climate uncertainties.
Balfour, you have 5 minutes left, okay?
Great, thanks. Women also make a significant contribution to disaster risk reduction and climate change through their contribution to food security. Small farmers in the region are the pillars of food security. They produce for the domestic market primarily. And although women are underrepresented in small farm registration, at their household level decision making is indispensable to domestic food supply chain and therefore is invaluable to the food supply and food access dynamics which interface with disaster risk reduction and climate change. I can't emphasize more the under-recognized contribution of women in this decision-making, from this decision-making perspective. I recall interviewing a farmer in rural Jamaica some years ago, and I was asking, what is it that determines the crops you grow each year? And he had no answer. Instead, he turned around and he said, Sadie, come here. And she came and he said, this man is asking what determined. And she says, well, I take the crops to market. And so I understand what the market needs. Essentially, she understands. She generates market intelligence that informs the production of crops. Similarly, she makes the allocation to the agricultural resource input. Women are also executors of disaster risk reduction and climate change extension intervention. Because of their skill in community networking, they're able to pass on the requisite information, the requisite knowledge to enhance our disaster risk reduction and climate change capacity. And of course, they're important in rural poverty alleviation, which reduces disaster vulnerability because of their ownership of small and micro enterprises. I want to summarize by saying that the focus of our agricultural system resilience, or focusing on agricultural systems resilience, is critical to reducing climate risk to this sector. Secondly, the critical role of women is under-recognized, it is rarely acknowledged, and should be if we are going to achieve our objectives for climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. Women must be seen, they remain the backbone of Caribbean agricultural system, despite the inequities in production resources. Finally, I would argue that the requisite and robust intervention for disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation for resilience development in Caribbean agriculture must go beyond the recognition of the vital role that women have played, continue to play, and will play in the future, but must simultaneously address the prevailing inequities in resources or in resource access among women. These interventions must of necessity also be gender sensitive in their approach. Thank you.
So much, Professor Spence. Certainly important to recognize the role of women in agriculture. Agriculture certainly is both positive in terms of its ability to support food security issues, but also plays a negative role in terms of its contribution to greenhouse gases and its large role in terms of water utilization. So there needs to be a balance, and certainly women, you've highlighted the fundamental role despite their marginalization in processes such as water conservation, biodiversity management, technical support for their husbands, marketing intelligence, and from the backyard gardens to post-harvest management, women play a vital role. So it's a critical insight that you provided for us, and I hope that we'll be able to speak to some of those challenges, that the undervaluation and the lack of recognition of women despite the fundamental support that they provide for rural communities, rural households, as well as our regional and national architecture for resilience. So I'd now like to ask Mrs. Hugh, to speak to her topic on women in disaster risk reduction and management. The floor is now yours, Mrs. Hugh.
Thank you very much. Thank you. My pleasure. And I just want to apologize for the bio you heard, which didn't say a word about my experience or knowledge in disaster. And I do have that. So I apologize you didn't hear it, but I am experienced in the area. However, I'd like to share my screen with you, the presentation. Share screen, where are we? Okay, are you seeing the women and disaster risk reduction? Okay, so we're looking at volunteers because that is the focus that I am now seeing that we needed to focus on. And the Red Cross, the Jamaica Red Cross, like all other Red Cross across the world, is an organization that is for volunteers. There are a few persons who are paid because they have to keep the doors open even when the volunteers go home, but it's primarily volunteers, people who give up their time and experience to provide assistance for persons who are in need of their assistance. We are part of an international movement, and we are auxiliaries to the government of Jamaica through an act of parliament. We sit on committees at the national and parish level, and we work very closely with ministries, Ministry of Labor and Social Security, with the Ministry of Health, and agencies like the Office of Disaster Preparedness, Emergency Management, other NGOs and other agencies. The approach that we are taking to disaster management has been comprehensive to ensure that we have the kind of coverage and support is to allow persons to move from early recovery, livelihood protection, resilience, sensitization to institutional development. We work primarily according to the expectations of the government to assist the roles as managing the priority shelters, providing damage and needs assessment, and providing food and non-food items, as well as working with the National Emergency Centers. We work, and I'm coming to what I was the major focus is women. How do volunteers and women fall into this picture? Because we have skeletal staff, minimal staff. The majority of work is carried out by volunteers. And so I will get to volunteers, and I will also get to women. The preparedness and mitigation work that we need to do, and recovery from disasters, as well as providing livelihood support. We look at ecosystem-based disaster reduction. We have a project called Resilient Islands that is being supported and allow us to be able to integrate the work of the ecosystem-based adaptation and to help to boost adaptive capacities for our people who have been found themselves in situations of disasters. They also design innovative tools, train leaders, and ensure that people who are vulnerable, especially those who live in coastal communities, are being sensitized, educated, addressed, and assisted. In mitigation, we are involved in epidemic control. Our volunteers, to a large extent, help us to be able to do that, as well as the development of mitigation. And so you could see what some of the work that we've done here, where this was the before, where people thought that garbage could go, and we provided them with a viable option that would reduce diseases and illnesses. We also provided tanks and asked them to help in creating a community map, and so that they're able to help themselves looking at the hazard maps, where are hazards and how do they avoid them. Coming to the main thing, which is talking about our volunteers and our women. We hired a gender specialist, and our gender specialist said they asked that they mainstream gender into disaster risk reduction. And so it was that our understanding that we were determining the differences between men and women. You're not seeing I am being told that you're not seeing the slideshow, is that correct? I would like.
Is there some technical assistance? I'm seeing
yes, there seems to be, because I'm being advised that you're.
I'm seeing the slideshow from my end. I'm not sure if there's a general.
Oh, you're seeing it. Well, somebody advised me that it's not being seen, so that's why I was trying to work at getting it to be seen. But if you're seeing it and nobody else is having a problem, then we're okay. All right, so I got to the point about looking at the mainstreaming gender, because there is an understanding that women, because there appear to be more volunteers in the Red Cross who are women, then that means that we need to focus on how we can address the perception or address the situation that would allow us to have both men and women, and not have it relegated to just one sex. And so as we talked about gender equity, I'm sure everybody, I'm not sure, but I well believe that you're accustomed to this slide, which shows that in order to be fair, the task is given to everyone the same. So the task is to climb a tree. And even though there's a goldfish there, and there is a cat, and there are some tiny animals, and there's a huge elephant, everybody, for equity to be fair, they must climb the tree. Well, that's not what the Red Cross wants to do, because our volunteers are male, are female, and they want to do not the same thing that everybody has to be able to do. We come with different skills and talents, and therefore it might well be that that is what I want to do, and I want to be able to do what I want to do and enjoy it. Women demonstrated to us that they were very more caring, some people said. And some people said that men left the work to women, the hard work, but then when they saw that the position, and I'm quoting from one of our volunteers, how glamorous that position was, then they started doing it. So there are things that motivate people. We have more women, it is claimed, because women tend to volunteer more than men. We haven't done a study that shows that women tend to volunteer more than men. But we are not willing to capture that as until we have done a study that categorically states that that is the case. But that's the feeling. We are looking at, however, what women do and how they do it. And it appears to us standard that from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, the women who headed National Disaster Organization, the people who headed those organizations were women. So we have Dr. Barbara Kirby, who was the head of the Jamaica's office, and we have Judy Thomas from Barbados, Connie Michael from Antigua, Dawn French from St. Lucia, and Charlene Dabrio from BVI. So women were taking the lead in these areas. Sometimes these are not volunteers all the way. Some of them are paid staff, and they were, well, not in the Red Cross, but in the National Disaster Offices. These were the heads. They executed really Herculean tasks, and they led the way for the effective disaster management and risk reduction programs. So it would be satisfactory to say that women head disaster agencies well. They carry out reasonably good, more than reasonably good, very good jobs. At the beginning of SEDIMA, there was a male head and a female deputy. And some said because you needed to balance, you needed the woman's perspective as well as the man's, whatever the men offer. But there needed to be a woman's perspective. And the PAHO head at the time was a female, and she was succeeded by a male. So both sexes can do both jobs. Now we get to the volunteers in the Jamaica Red Cross. There's a high percentage of female volunteers in Jamaica. So many of our branch directors, who are the lead practitioners, are mainly women. The branch chairmen or the decision makers are also volunteers, and they used to be mainly men, but this is beginning to change now. So for 2019-2020 membership by sex, our branch directors, 11 are female and 2 are male. That's telling you about the volunteer aspect of the how many people are volunteering. So whether they are all 13 of them are not enough, but just the comparison of how many women compared to men. The chairman, there are 7 female chairmen compared to the 3 males. Now, in some countries in the Red Cross, they are more male Red Cross members than there are in our country, for example. So we are dominant women, but in other countries. So there are some countries in Central America, for example, where the members, Red Cross members, are exempt from the draft into the army. That's a good motivation to become a member of the Red Cross. And so they will volunteer for the Red Cross because they don't have to go into the army and be sent off to war. And so it seems that a fair deduction to attribute that to the fact that they are free. And so here's a picture. This is now in Iran. And if you look at that gentleman up front, that is a Jamaican. It would be a Jamaican. That is, and in the back, where women are in Iran, is the other Jamaican who is a female. So there is a Jamaican male and a Jamaican female. So Jamaican male is in front and the woman is beside. The only other woman that I see, this is the way some countries are, male dominating volunteers as opposed to females. So it is clear to us in the Red Cross, however, that women fulfill all the functions from the highest decision making all the way to pushing shovels and doing whatever is required. Some of the larger Red Cross societies across the world are headed by women. Women are the presidents and leaders of these. So women are finding their own now as volunteers as well. They say that women volunteers do more than men. And again, I can only say that that is anecdotal until we have done a study to determine if that's a fact. But when things happen frequently enough, you talk about it. In terms of our role in disasters, we are auxiliaries to the government, as I mentioned earlier on, and we acknowledge that affected people should have their needs met in a timely and adequate and appropriate fashion. And many Red Cross associates say men direct while women act. So if the woman needs to have a need met, a woman would do it better because they are softer and kinder. Those are what the members themselves, the volunteers, say. And it happens because there's no challenge to the status. When it is said, nobody challenges it until it is accepted as fact. So here we see some action by Red Cross volunteers. There's a man and he's doing what is said to be a man's job of the rough work. And there are the women doing the nice job of feeding women. These are volunteers giving up their time to assist others. Now, Red Cross men try to attract other men because if we're in an organization where we are in the minority, it might appear that there's something wrong with, we should join organizations that have more men. And so they try to attract other men. And so they target groups where there are many men. And so in this picture, you could see that the representative of what seems to be a primarily male-dominated organization is being wooed, and hopefully he will bring along all his members as well as volunteers. Now, we've been asked if there are roles that are better suited to one sex. Are there some things that we do in the Red Cross that would be better if the volunteers were men or women? On the picture on the left at the top, you will see Red Cross men addressing a serious problem, but there in the middle of all of that is a woman. If you look carefully, you will see that woman is in the middle of everything, trying to make ends meet and provide assistance. In the other middle picture at the top, they are building a house, and the Red Cross women will not be left out. So they go and provide assistance, not just providing handouts. They want to be in the middle of things, and that they are there. We have as well the other way around. So this gentleman on the right was at the time of this picture taken the president of the Jamaica Red Cross, a volunteer, and yet he found it necessary to assist with food, which they have given to the women. That's what women do. We also try to encourage by training the men, because maybe men don't do it, not because they don't want to do it, but because they can't. And so we train the young men as they are growing up to be able to provide the meals, not just hand them out, but be able to provide them. And so we have our volunteers. There is another volunteer role that is considered to be male-dominated, and that's first aid, because it's the driving of an ambulance, the lifting of injured people, and only men can do that. But our women also show that they know how to do first aid, and they can provide the service if allowed. And so in the Jamaica Red Cross, we allow and provide the support for all of our volunteers to do all that they're able. we are looking at this slide, which shows some persons who we have to pay, the professionals, to do building to get back somebody's house in order. And so the volunteers join the paid persons. And if you look at this picture on there, right, there is a woman in that mix, two women in that mix. The Red Cross volunteer, women volunteer, will not stay out of doing what they want to do because they were committed to do it. And on the left, there is a woman, she's probably supervising, but there is a woman in the mix. So Red Cross and our women, we work together, as this picture shows. They are supportive of each other, and we want to restore family links. We want to do all the things, providing psychosocial support, and we have a very good team who do that. And we, however, notice that women grasp the opportunities for training. So we are always training our volunteers. We want them to do what they do well. And so we have had people trained in capacity development, in conflict resolution, several different skills. And believe it or not, if you look closely enough at this picture, the majority of persons who turn out for training are women. So that's where we get our women who will like excel as leaders because they get the training, they want to be there. And some people say that's because they are available. The men have to go to work. Some of these women are housewives. That's what some people say. But some people actually take the time and ask that things be scheduled when they are not at work so that they can be available. We have seen where our men, Red Cross volunteers, have begun to show that they can lead as women do in the area of caring. And the women strategize, they establish teams to develop the policies, and they help to identify effective programs. Men provide broad, but they also provide experience. And we try not to compartmentalize and cause people to see only one side of each set of volunteers. But I have to say that we are predominantly in the Red Cross women. We will find out why it is that more women volunteer, and perhaps some of you could share with me your thoughts on why there are more women volunteering. We have our thoughts too, but we will do a study and get that accurate. But why do women volunteer with the Red Cross more than men? And we encourage and laud them and want them to recognize that we appreciate all that they are doing for us. We couldn't do it without you. So this opportunity is to bring to the fore all the people who are working. Thank you.
Excellent presentation. Thank you, Mrs. Hugh, for giving us that very lovely picture of the role of women in the Red Cross in disaster risk reduction and management within the Caribbean. I liked your panoramic perspective, and certainly emphasizing the fundamental role that women play in volunteerism. So they represent not just the backbone in the agricultural sector, as was highlighted by Professor Spence, but also within our care economies, within the care ecosystem. And they're not, again, because of their volunteer status, not being given the appropriate recognition, as well as monetary compensation, as volunteers are generally not paid. So women have been subsidizing the reproduction of our societies, of our economies, of our disaster relief mechanisms, and our agroecological resilience. So I just want to open the floor now to questions. Two beautiful presentations. We have the first question going to Balfour Spence, Professor Spence, from David Smith. And that question is, does the GDP label graph that you used imply that agriculture provides only low-end employment? That is to you.
Okay. No, thanks for the question, David. No, I don't think that's what the graph is indicating. What it indicates is that in states where the GDP per capita is low, then the percentage contribution of agriculture to GDP is higher. All right. So what it's showing is that there is an inverse relationship between the percentage contribution of agriculture to GDP and the per capita GDP of the country. So it is not saying that, agriculture underproduces low-end activities. And this is a norm in most economic models where as the per capita GDP increases, then the share of agriculture in its macroeconomic contribution tends to decline.
Thank you for your response. Just wanted to highlight that in the comments, we're getting feedback that indicates that not only in the areas of disaster relief, management and leadership have women been taking a central role, but also in community farming groups within the case study of Jamaica, women are becoming better organized and playing a stronger leadership role in these areas. So perhaps we need to ask the question if there's any particular reasons why it is that women tend to move so dominantly in leadership in these critical areas, but are still not recognized. Perhaps that is a question we could throw to the panel and to the audience. Another comment that was raised in the forum is that it's very interesting that we still using language like male dominated language like chairman, in spite of the fact that there's a complete flexibility in the roles, as highlighted in your presentation by Mrs. Hugh. The stereotypes are broken down in volunteerism, even though there tends to be a division of labor in certain areas. The lines across the activities for volunteerism are not written in stone, but they are blurred, and there's a lot of movement across these lines in terms of the activities of our volunteers. So we need to operate. Another comment from our audience, from Kirby Beard, that we need to move towards gender neutral mainstreaming.
Yes.
Much must be implemented in all fields. Perhaps he can explain the difference between gender neutral and the typical language of just gender mainstreaming that is used in the discussion of trying to empower the groups, men and women, to take a more active role in decision making and in our social and economic systems for enhancing resilience to shocks such as disasters and managing in response to them. Ms. Hugh, you had a comment? Mrs. Hugh?
Yes, I wanted to apologize. I was just saying here that it is strange that I should have, maybe I was nervous. I don't need excuses, but yes, gender neutral terms are the things we promote here and want to keep going, where we speak a language that is gender neutral. So my apologies for not having done that.
Okay, thank you for that comment, political comment. Certainly, it's important to be even-handed in how we speak, but where recognition is due, then it can certainly be done in non-neutral language. in terms of the predominant weight that women have been playing in the disaster risk reduction management process, both in terms of, as you said, from the carrying the spade and shoveling to leadership at the highest echelons in regional, international, and national bodies. And you gave a long list of examples there of women who have taken up that call for leadership despite the lack of reward in terms of recognition or even in terms of the monetary compensation. So there is something there that needs to be investigated, as suggested by Mrs. Hugh. Why is it that there is a higher capacity for women involved in these activities, despite the fact that the incentives on the face of it are not that strong in terms of the respect and the recognition that we would hope should be given to such a critical set of actors in this portfolio, this disaster management and disaster risk reduction. One of the questions I'd like to throw out to the presenter, Professor Spence, you mentioned that there was the absence of a comprehensive risk relief program in the Caribbean, and how that then led to a higher dependence on donor funds and governmental support. Do you see any movements in or deliberations within regional networks towards actually addressing that absence?
Thanks for the question, moderator. Yes, what I was saying is that there is an absence of any dedicated risk transfer mechanism, and there I'm talking primarily risk insurance for the agricultural sector. Now, we recognize that the absence of agricultural insurance is in Caribbean agriculture results from the high risk of the sector. With that kind of high risk, it would be virtually impossible for farmers, especially small-scale farmers, to pay the kind of premiums that are required. So in that regard, there is a need for specially designed risk transfer mechanisms for this sector. In terms of what movements there are in that direction, yes, there have been. A few years ago, I was engaged by the British Virgin Islands to develop a microinsurance strategy for their small-scale production sector, include agriculture, fisheries, and low-income households. So there's that. They're actually implementing that strategy right now. Also within the CRIF, there is talk and there is some movement towards the creation of a microinsurance mechanism that would specifically address the agricultural sector, and more specifically, the small-scale agricultural sector. So I think that that need is recognized, and there are indeed movements towards addressing it.
Thank you so much for your response. Just wanted to give two brief comments on the presentations before I introduce the third panel. There was a comment on Professor Spence's presentation by Kevin Douglas, who said he found your, sorry, I was reading the wrong comment. It's a comment on Professor Spence's presentation by Joan Cummins, who indicated that she deeply appreciated the presentation on women in agriculture. And she was emphasizing that for many female farmers within civil society, such as Judith Wedderburn and the Frederick E. Buxton Jamaica organization, they have worked in this sector and their lived experiences heavily validate the data and analysis that was provided. And in terms of a comment on Mrs. Hughes, Kyle Biggs wanted to say that he found it to be a lovely presentation, and he enjoyed, or she enjoyed, he or she enjoyed your observations about women's leadership and initiative in the Red Cross. So it just leaves me to thank our two presenters for their wonderful contributions highlighting the role of women despite their marginalization in terms of their recognition and appropriate reward. So our next panel, we will begin with, we will have three presenters, and our first presenter will speak, Dr. Thera Edwards will speak to Women in Disaster Risk Reduction and Climate Change Research, after which we will have Ms. Judith Wedderburn, who is going to speak to us on her topic of choice. And she is in the Institute for Gender and Development Studies. And then our final speaker for today will be Ms. Elizabeth Riley, and she is the Executive Director acting for the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency. And she will be speaking to the contribution of women to disaster risk reduction in the Caribbean, a regional approach. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes introducing them, and then I'll ask our first presenter, Dr. Edwards, to begin after I make our brief introductions. So Dr. Edwards has worked in environment and agriculture since early 90s and has a wide experience in agriculture, conservation, biodiversity, protected areas, and watershed management. Her areas of professional specialization include biodiversity, protected areas, vegetation, ecology, geographical information systems and mapping, as well as project mapping. She is currently map curator of the Map and Image Library and lecturer in the Department of Geography and Geology at the University of the West Indies at Mona. She is an individual member of the International Society for Photogrammetry and Remote Sensing, and in Jamaica, she serves on the Council of the Jamaica Geographical Society and is currently chairman of the board of the Caribbean Coastal Area Management Foundation. Our second speaker, Ms. Judith Wedderburn, is a recently retired director of the Frederick Ebert Stiftung Organization, FES Jamaica, and for over 30 years, she has worked as an educator, a trainer, and an advocate and researcher in the field of gender and development in Jamaica and the wider Caribbean. Her main areas of work have included training in gender issues and climate change, poverty, globalization, and the media, and for gender responsive policy. As a dedicated civil society activist, Ms. Wedderburn has also supported lobbying and advocacy activities for legislative reform and policy development, and has served on a number of public sector and civil society boards. Our final speaker, Ms. Riley, is Executive Director acting at the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, CDEMA. She has over 20 years experience in the area of disaster management at the regional and international levels in various capacities. As a Deputy Executive Director at CDEMA, she had overall responsibility for the agency's technical programming and provided strategic guidance in the areas of preparedness and response, mitigation, recovery, education and training, as well as information management. At the operational level, Ms. Riley has played a leadership role in the coordination of regional responses to Hurricanes Ivan, the earthquake in Haiti in 2010, Tropical Storm Erica, Joaquin, Matthew, Irma, Maria, Dorian, and her field experience includes the leadership of the CDMA deployment teams in the aftermath of Hurricanes Irma and Dorian in 2017 and 2019. Ms. Riley is currently playing a leadership role in the coordination of the region's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. At an international level, she has contributed to a range of technical advisory committees and is currently the vice chair of the Caribbean Early Warning Systems Group of Experts on Coastal Hazards. And she also sits on the Regional Advisory Group, leading the implementation of the regional strategy for Latin America and the Caribbean on disaster risk management in the agriculture and food and nutrition sectors. So it is my indeed great pleasure to welcome these three eminent panelists to make their presentation and speak to their topics. We will begin with Dr. Edwards, who will be speaking to women in disaster risk reduction and climate change research. Over to you, Thera.
Thank you very much for your introduction, Pat. It is my pleasure to be here this afternoon with all the distinguished panelists and the really amazing presentations that we've been having so far that have covered the breadth and depth of disaster risk reduction, climate response. And I'm really here this afternoon to share the work of my colleagues in the Department of Geography and Geology and the Center for Marine Sciences primarily, but to acknowledge that the women of the Faculty of Science and Technology in other departments are also very much involved in disaster risk reduction and climate change, climate variability research. Just getting my screen ready. Can I be allowed to share my screen? I'm sharing. Okay, great. So when you look at what you normally see in the literature, and here is a learning companion about gender and disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. This manual or companion book says across the world, women tend to hold less power and to have control over fewer resources than men at every institutional level. Women's disadvantage to their unequal access to resources, legal protection, decision-making, and power, their reproductive burden, and their vulnerability to violence consistently render them more vulnerable than men to the impacts of climate change and disasters. Understanding how gender relations shape women's and men's lives is therefore critical to effective climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. And what I am doing this afternoon is showing how the group of women that I'm featuring are changing this narrative to this one, where we have multiple research areas covering a plethora of dimensions of the disaster risk reduction and climate change agenda being undertaken by women in the Faculty of Science and Technology. The research I'm highlighting covers water resources and water access, environment and biodiversity, people, and livelihoods. The first researcher that I would like to feature is Dr. Arpita Mandal, who's a senior lecturer in the Department of Geography and Geology, whose focal areas of research are hydrology, hydrological modeling, and water resources. And what I'm doing with each slide is just juxtaposing little bits of sound bites out of the disaster narrative. And here we have Rosa Juarez, who's saying, "The river has taken everything, my animals, house, land, even my family." And we have persons like Dr. Mandal, whose research is helping persons like Rosa to not have these experiences, along with colleagues like Dr. Arpita Nandi out of the Tennessee, East Tennessee State University. She has done some riverine flood hazard ratings across the island of Jamaica, looking at areas where there's relatively no hazard to very high hazard. And of course, the key communities as shown by the points that are within threat of these very high or high hazard areas. She's also done research on tropical storms, and in particular, she's looked at the Yalos River and what happened with Tropical Storm Gustav, looking at 1 hour rainfall using the HEC and HMS modules of ArcGIS, and looking at flooding, investigating areas of flood inundation and matching inflows and outflows during the flood event. Dr. Mandal's work has also extended into the South Negril Orange River watershed, looking again at the generation of flow data from upstream input using similar modeling software. Again, also now extending by looking at catchment inflows, rainfall inflows, and the area of terrestrial flood inundation. Her work, this work has also formed part of collaborative studies with the Climate Studies Group of the University of the West Indies. And as always, there's a mentoring component where postgraduate students of Dr. Mandal, such as Melissa Curtis and Peter Gay Harris, have been involved and getting valuable experience in doing these projects. The next researcher that I would like to focus on is Dr. Shanika Lester, whose focal areas of research are social and political dimensions of water security. And we all can recognize just how devastating droughts are. Dr. Spence, was looking at farming and speaking how vulnerable farming is as an occupation. And the quote I have here is, at a women's village meeting in a camp in Darfur, Oxfam consulted extensively with women and other vulnerable groups to discuss their concerns and to make sure that projects met villagers' precise needs. And this fits in very well with Shanika's aim of looking at the social and political dimensions of water security. And one of her projects looked at integrated and sustainable management of water resources, where she created a water accessibility index as an effective tool to measure differences in access in areas of high piped water coverage. This index contributes to an understanding of the vulnerabilities that exist within the Kingston water supply system, which, as you are aware, for those of us from Jamaica, I'm not sure where persons are listening in from, is one of the most stressed water supply systems. And it also contributes to decision-making pathways of the institutional actors, such as our utility agencies within the water sector. And it looks at addressing issues of access and equity and constructing Jamaica's current urban water governance framework and how it shapes not only sustainability, but insecurity or security within the city as it relates to water. Another very important project that she participated in while just a graduate student was surviving the drought and irrigation curriculum for small-scale farmers. And this project utilized a learning by doing and discovery-based learning approach to build the capacity of 57 farmers, both males and females, in 3 of the driest communities in southern St. Elizabeth, Yardley Chase, Southfield, Red Bank, and Ballards Valley in on-farm water management. The interesting thing is that this was a €20,000 funded project, which the curriculum that was developed is now being formalized as with RADA and will be ongoing. So it's not something that we see very often that died with the project, but now is going to become a living document. One of the positive outcomes in this day when we're celebrating the role of women is that female farmers who were involved in the project actually enjoyed higher levels of productivity in their crops. I now turn to another one of my colleagues, Dr. Roseanne Smith, whose focal areas of work look at vulnerability to disaster risk and the role of risk perception. And we start off by looking at local residents in Trinidad, Bolivia, who have built bridges between elevated seabeds that they call camelones. And there, the flooding is increasingly unpredictable in this area of the Amazon basin. And there is an Oxfam program that supported flood mitigation and food security. The program also looked at women's leadership in food production and aimed to reduce vulnerability to floods and strengthen post-flood recovery. These camelones help to minimize or prevent loss of plants and seeds. And so this fits in very well with Dr. Smith's work, where she's very much passionate. She likes to use the word passionate about vulnerability to disaster risk. One of her most recent projects was the design of a framework of tools to assess mangrove habitat and related climate adaptation and disaster risk mitigation measures through mangrove preservation and or restoration activities, which was a World Bank funded project. What takes me great pleasure to announce too is that Roseanne Smith was also joined by R. Peter Mandel, Tanisha Edwards, Mona Weber, and Patrice Francis as ladies of the Faculty of Science and Technology. And we've already focused on Dr. Mandel's work, and later in the presentation, we will see the work of Professor Mona Weber. So there is this publication, Forces of Nature, and I have the URL for the publication, and it's very, very good. She's also been involved in assessment of the strengths and weaknesses of disaster risk management in several Caribbean islands by application of a comprehensive disaster risk reduction audit tool. And that work was conducted for the United Nations Office of Disaster Risk Reduction. And we have her pictured here after one of her community workshops, where again, it's not just going in and meeting the people and extracting the information, but she went back to share with the community members the findings, along with Patrice Francis, who you see with the other red arrow pointing to her position in the group. Dr. Smith has also looked at the economic valuation of seasonal drought information in Jamaica. So we're seeing the links between Dr. Lester's work with water scarcity, water indexes, and of course, Dr. Smith's work with seasonal drought information. And now I move to Professor Mona Weber, who is the head for the Center for Marine Sciences, whose focal area of work that I am looking at today is mangrove restoration. But I could just say that she's the mangrove guru because she's looked at mangroves in so many ways. And lately, she's also been looking at the effects of microplastics. The contrasting quote here is Natyang Anna and her daughter plant tree seedlings in Karamahoha, Uganda. Oxfam encouraged the villages to replant their forest and provided saplings to women. And Professor Weber, and her colleagues have been focused extensively on mangrove restoration. So Professor Weber and her team, inclusive of Mr. Camilio Trench, who she describes as their mangrove restoration expert, have worked on mangrove restoration projects at 9 sites across 6 parishes in Jamaica. They have worked at Lilliput St. James, Bogue, Malcolm's Bay in St. Elizabeth, the Airport Runway Lagoon in Port Royal, the Palisados Roadway, Refuge Key, Portland Cottage, Winds Morass in Trelawney, and the Portmore Causeway. And you can see that a significant number of meters squared, kilometers squared of mangroves have been restored under this initiative. In the tropics, mangroves along with seagrass and coral reefs contribute significantly to the health, welfare, and daily livelihood of the majority of 1.3 billion people living within 100 kilometers of the coast in these developing countries. And so mangroves offer tremendous ecosystem services, regulating services, by trapping sediment in land runoff, removing nutrients from sewage and fertilizers. They are a sort of shoreline and infrastructure protection, green infrastructure, if you will. And they're able to absorb 70 to 90% of the energy of a normal wave. They also serve as valuable sinks for carbon sequestration. And so we are underscoring the importance of the work undertaken by Professor Webb and her team in both mangrove ecology and mangrove restoration. And now, Mrs. Marcia Creary-Ford, who is the Environmental Data Manager in the Caribbean Coastal Data Center in the Center for Marine Sciences, who specializes in coral reef ecology and monitoring. Coral reefs are valuable economic resources for many people, providing food, habitation, and income, and reefs have the highest biodiversity in the sea. Therefore, their conservation and sustainable management are an urgent priority. Mrs. Creary-Ford has done research looking at bleaching, in particular, looking at bleaching events that have occurred between 2015 to 16, when we had approximately 25% of live corals bleached, resulting in 4% mortality. And this was actually a global mass bleaching event, but this was the work to see what was happening within the Caribbean and in particular Jamaica. And from this research, it emphasized the need for continued research in adaptation, looking at coral reef restoration, identification of resilient species and reef refugia, and of course underscores support for mitigation through the Paris Agreement. Mrs. Creary-Ford has also looked at ocean acidification, an ongoing decline in ocean pH caused primarily by uptake of excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It is a major threat to marine ecosystems worldwide. And this research aims to establish a baseline for carbon dioxide in the coastal waters of Jamaica. And it will help to develop a time series data set to better discern changes in ocean acidification over the long term. And there's some pictures of in situ pH sensors, the ISAMI sensor deployed in the, well, I wouldn't say in the field, but on the sea floor. And of course, collection of water samples for pH and alkalinity determination. And now my own work, where I like to look at landscape history and historical geography, what's happening over the long term in landscapes. Historical landscape research can inform theoretical work in new and productive ways. It bridges the gap between research areas that have the potential to enrich our understanding of everyday landscapes. And it was for this reason that I was very delighted in one of the first presentations earlier today, when the importance by Dr. Deborah Villarreal-Lamb of interdisciplinary approaches and transdisciplinary approaches to research. And I started out by looking at Carlisle Bay, Clarendon in a historical sense, where there was an old fort, site of the last attempt by the French to wrest Jamaica from the British, and looking for historical remains, and then segueing into long-term coastal changes. But what we had when we were there was that we realized through aerial photos and satellite imagery was that the hard remains of a pier and a house associated with settlements at that coastal location were very much visible, and they provided permanent reference points for us to measure distance from the shore. And so, starting a little bit further back than this image in 1789, but in 1766, we assembled, and I say we in terms of my research colleagues, Professor Edward Robinson and Dr. Kurt McLaren, a series of reliable surveys, plans, maps, aerial photos, and satellite imagery to measure shoreline change over time. And what we had was this house, as you see in the 1950s and again in 2013, where it is very much identifiable as well as the pier, the curvature of the fort, and based on where the fort and the house were represented, we were able to measure the distance to the tree line, the orange measurements, and the distance to the shoreline. From this, we were able to calculate the average recession rate of the shoreline over an approximate 250-year period. And we arrived at a 0.35 meter per year recession rate. We are still refining, making sure that all our GIS rectifications and measurements are accurate, but that is where we are at with the work to date. And finally, just to show that there is a lot of scope for the different areas and disciplines to come together. Recently, while working on the State of the Jamaica Climate Report, I had some class data where Professor Weber takes her students out to a particular mangrove location, and she gave me 10 years of data, which I have started to analyze. And some of the things that we have done is looked at mangrove density by species, by year, and by the meter squared, because it's a belt transect, and investigating through various types of plots, box plots, scatter plots, and some principal components analysis, Pearson's correlation. What are some of the factors, not only just density, but looking at alkalinity, salinity, well, not alkalinity, pH, salinity, water depth, and so on, temperature, and just looking at how the factors correlate. So it only leaves for me to thank the colleagues who provided information on their research, Professor Mona Weber, Dr. Roseanne Smith, Mrs. Marcia Crary Ford, Dr. Shanika Lester, and Dr. Arpita Mandal, to just highlight just the extent of the research that is ongoing and has been occurred previously towards disaster risk reduction, both in the human and biophysical and environmental dimensions. Thank you very much.
Presentation, really food for thought, as well as a depth of the research capacities that we have within our shores, and the critical work that women are doing in knowledge production, which complements the work that women are doing in knowledge transmission, and certainly in archiving and restoring memories, which can be used for scientific analysis for ensuring our resilience and mitigating our risk. I now wish to turn over the floor to Ms. Judith Wedderburn. We're running just 15 minutes behind, but I hope that we'll be able to catch up at the end. Judith, you now have the floor.
I need to share. Are you seeing that?
Not yet.
Not yet? Oh dear. Let me try that one again. Okay. I have to share this. I have to touch this share screen. So much. So I apologize that you didn't, Madam Chair, get, I'm choosing my title very carefully, Madam Chair. Ahead of time, Women and Disaster Risk Reduction, Claiming Voice and Space. So my presentation is a little different because my experience has been really on the ground, working with, listening to young women and young men in a number of communities, probably more rural areas, but including some urban areas. When I was asked to do some very basic climate change training with them. So Joan Grant Cummings would have been part of the team. So for that reason, I would like to really commend Professor Spence for highlighting the gender inequalities in Caribbean stroke Jamaican agriculture, because that is well documented. And for Dr. Edwards, I'm absolutely fascinated by your research and your modeling. If many decades ago, when I went to the university, they did geography instead of geology, I would have done human geography, but they didn't offer it. So, but I really welcome your research, acknowledging the team of women you have working with you and some young men, but I can't tell you how encouraging that is to be able to access that right here in Jamaica. So thank you very much. So, assuming that we were going to have some students in amongst us, I don't know if we do. I would normally start off just by asking some questions, because sometimes I make assumptions that people understand, we all understand and interpret things the same way. So I would ask first, who is at risk? Which vulnerable groups? And women as vulnerable, or victims, or as resilient survivors? That's the question those are the questions that run through my mind. And then I would posit that we understand that disaster risks arise when hazards interact with physical, social, stroke, gender, economic, and environmental vulnerabilities. So the vulnerabilities are many. And then I would ask some other questions of, when we talk about policies and strategies for the reduction of risks, who do we think should be involved in discussing, creating, implementing policies and strategies? And how we can help people to better understand that there are visible impacts as well as some not so visible impacts on people's lives. My approach is to say, let us focus on the many human faces involved, and in this space, as the presenters so far have done, recognize the contribution of women to disaster risk management in the Caribbean. How would I recommend that I would go about it is to use a gender lens and examine the impacts of severe weather events on women, not just women, women and men and their families, all the vulnerable groups, to better understand the tasks they carry out in the face of disasters and the gender relations which dominate their lived experiences as they carry out these tasks. So I refer very briefly to a UNDP study titled Enhancing Gender Visibility in Disaster Risk Management and Climate Change. And it reminds us that not all Caribbean countries are SIDS, but they all face particular vulnerabilities: economic, environmental, social, gender. It reminds us of the frequency of hazards. It lists some of the countries, but importantly, it clarifies for the reader exactly what the UNFCCC conventions agreements are. For my conversation today, my focus is on the Hyogo framework of action, because in that framework, the countries who are signatories to the UNFCCC conventions are committed to certain development objectives, such as the inclusion of gender perspectives in all disaster risk management policies and decision-making processes, including those related to risk assessment, early warning, information management, and education and training. So how do we make this happen? So I argue then, it's not just about having women there. For me, understanding our work in gender, it's never about add women, add men, and mix. It's not about the numbers. It is about the gender relations and perspectives in our lives. So we observe and know that women and men have different life experiences in homes, school, communities, whether it's rural or urban, different social classes and religious. We know that they have different access to knowledge, information, resources, and may respond differently to these. We also know that they hold different perspectives and expectations of themselves and others, and these are shaped mostly by points 1 and 2. So as women and men, we identify different priorities for ourselves, although there are some influences that remain, some dominant stereotypical influences. I would want to extend this conversation by using a gender lens and ask some questions, especially in respect of disaster risk reduction, for which we need to have a management component. Who has access to and control over household and community resources, material and non-material resources, and who decides? Who benefits from the use and distribution of these resources? What are the consequences of the unequal distribution of resources as they affect women and men along the lines of gender? If we're able to have these conversations, explore these questions, and then use data which is available, along the lines of sex and gender, then we can ask, in that context, we can ask, what are the practical and strategic ways in which existing policies and programs in municipalities, because it is that level, certainly that I feel, that we can have more effective promotion of DRR policies which are gender responsive. So I'm going to share with you, oops, sorry, I did that too quickly. Right. So working with Panos Caribbean, a couple of years ago, we did some sensitization and training in a number of communities, including communities with persons with disabilities. So this is a summary of the differential gender impacts of hazards on women and men. So I'm not going to read us through all 7 points on both sides, but what comes up very clearly is the different ways in which hazards can affect women and men. And it puts into context the social and economic and environmental issues with which we have to contend. I didn't burden us with data, but there is data to basically confirm what we say, what we mean when we say the gender impact on women is that they have larger families, usually with more children and elderly and persons with disabilities. Our survey of living conditions can give us the precise numbers. Conversely, gender impact on men is that they usually have a smaller family with fewer children or elderly or persons with disabilities. We know that at least 47% of our households are headed by single women who have one regular income. We have a number of households also headed by men, but those usually have access to 2 incomes, the man who's a household head and his partner. So in the case of a hazard and talking about shared responsibilities, we observe that new tasks may emerge in the home. So in addition to the normal caring household work, for example, care for persons with disabilities, the gender expectation is that the women will take on whatever new tasks emerge. And what the women would explain to us is that in addition to doing the normal caring work, if a window needs to be fixed, I have to do it. If the roof needs to be battened down, I have to do it, etc. That's not to say she could not possibly get support outside of the home. On the man's side, we know that part of the gender expectations is that men in communities often get involved in activities outside of the home, post-disaster, and they are at increased risk of physical injury. Importantly, after the disaster, what often happens is that they have access to repair work in post-disaster situations. On the other hand, the women in the households have limited options for employment because their primary role still remains as caregivers. Now I'm saying this, some of this is data, most of this is data driven, but even the data acknowledges some dominant trends while acknowledging that some changes in gender relations are taking place. So then it's to better understand how women are able to contribute. I argue that we have to better understand the context in which the women's lived experiences are affecting how they contribute to disaster risk reduction or management. So in summary, I advocate that more work is needed. So we have to identify the different needs and experiences which women and men have in disasters, how women and men are affected differently, and how they respond to risks involved and why they respond the way they do. I further recommend that we deepen this understanding by using time use studies to demonstrate which tasks women and men perform during and after in the immediate post-disaster period. I'm arguing that we should be guided by this knowledge to better understand and perhaps question why the designation of woman as either vulnerable or victim. Now, reflecting on what the contribution at different levels of women that Professor Spencer spoke about in the adaptation side, and that our friend who is head of from the Red Cross, what was your name again? I'm sorry, Miss Lois Hugh.
Miss Hugh.
Miss Hugh. Mm-hmm. So acknowledging that there are levels of decision making in various organizations like the Red Cross or organizations like RADA, with which I had a fairly close relationship, that there are women who are active on the ground with RADA, but they're not in the spaces where decisions are made about things that affect their daily lives. So the other work that continues is to build the capacity of community members, women and men, to understand the gender relations that they live in, because it's a lived experience, and how these shape their own participation as women and men in decisions about policies and strategies to reduce risk. I recommend further that we can use these spaces in which women can rightfully claim their voice and space, which communities themselves will then better understand that the care work that must be done, have a better understanding of the deeper value of it, not only socially to their families and communities, but to the GDP. Professor Spence made brief reference to that. I want to refer very quickly now to a UNDP ECLAC guide to gender-aware post-disaster needs assessment, which is a tool which is used to identify and assess post-disaster needs of women, men, boys, and girls across sectors. Now, the findings of this needs assessment closely mirror the different demands and social gender expectations that women and men generally face due to the gendered roles and responsibilities. The constant factor is the care work and the attitude to care work as an essential and permanent feature of households before, during, and after severe weather event. It's work that must be done, whatever, regardless of what else is taking place. Now, we are observing, I'm sure, in our daily lives that you're beginning to see shifts in how much of the care work is beginning to be undertaken by the father of the children, if the father is around. So I'm acknowledging that and bigging the men up for that. But the dominant expression, the dominant relation is still one in which, despite all of I'm really impressed by the accomplishments and the ways in which Professor Spence spoke about women's contribution as small-scale farmers to local food consumption and food security. It's very impressive, and we are aware that they do it. But they're doing this in addition to carrying the burden of the care work that they must continue to do. So I asked myself, what if we could find a way to provide financial support or pay for care work, however we work out that process and the shared responsibilities? How would that look? What space would then that create for those same women in small farming to be more active and take on board the new farming technologies, greenhouse growing, all those things which are now on the table? Wouldn't they have a better opportunity to even grow more in that space and contribute to local food consumption and food security? So the permanence of the burden, I'm using the word burden because if you talk to some of these women, you understand that it is not easy, okay? To have to continue to care, to be responsible for the care work without the support which recognizes the inherent value of this work.
Judy, just letting you know that you're up on the time limit.
I want to make one last plea that the way that, just listening to what Mrs. Hughes said about the work that volunteer women do in the Red Cross, for the women on the team of researchers about which Dr. Edwards spoke, the way that women are doing what they can do in agriculture does not suggest that these women are working from a victim perception of themselves at all. I see them as resilient contributors, survivors, who are exercising their human agency and right to voice and place in the process of disaster risk reduction. I think that would be more appropriate. Wherever there's space in this huge, massive process of disaster risk reduction is, that is what I think. That's how I would more appropriately treat them. And finally, just to ask you to look at the CEDAW General Recommendation 87, which affirm that women's involvement in the way that I'm speaking is not just important, but it's also a right, and they speak specifically to climate change and disaster prevention, mitigation, response, and recovery. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your brilliant contribution, Judith, claiming voice and space on the ground and asking a series of critical questions that would allow us to be able to do effective gender analysis of the differential burdens, opportunities, and capacities to do more in responding to the needs of their community in the context of disaster and post-disaster situations. I now ask our final presenter, Ms. Elizabeth Riley, last but not least, to hold the floor on the issues related to the contribution of women to disaster risk reduction in the Caribbean, a regional snapshot. I turn the floor over to you, Ms. Riley.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And first, allow me to express my thanks to the organizers of today's meeting for inviting me to participate and for SEDIMA to make a contribution. I am going to share the screen. Just give me one moment. And okay, wonderful. So the presentation is entitled The Contribution of Women to Disaster Risk Reduction in the Caribbean, a Regional Snapshot. And in the presentation, I'll touch on 5 things to say a little bit about SEDIMA for those who may be watching or have the opportunity to watch the recording later, and to speak in keeping with the theme of today's International Day on Disaster Reduction, on disaster risk governance and how the structures within the Caribbean facilitate participation of women in that context. Then I want to say a little bit on women in disaster risk reduction, what we have seen happening at the national level and also at the regional level, to zero in for a short while on a case study which was done in Barbados looking at women in volunteerism, and then some general observations and some points that we can consider for going forward. So many of you may be familiar with SEDIMA. We are an arm of the Caribbean community with responsibility for addressing things related to disaster management. We have a wide mandate, which includes information management, coordination of relief. We support countries in reducing the consequences of disasters, mainly through policies, practice, standards, and also, very importantly, advocacy. And we have a remit to support our states to ensure that they maintain an adequate capability for addressing disaster response. And we also work through, very importantly, partnerships, including partnerships with a range of groups. Our geographical remit is a big one. In fact, as of September 1, 2020, we have 19 participating states, with the addition of Cayman Islands formally joining us on September 1st. We welcome the Cayman Islands, and the islands and the continental states and multi-island states of the SEDIMA system are indicated in yellow on screen. So from a governance perspective, the CDM strategy 2014 to 2024 offers a range of appropriate spaces where conversations related to the role that various groups, including women, can play in supporting the whole agenda of resilience building. And the regional strategy, as you see, speaks to safer, more resilient and sustainable Caribbean states. And we have 4 result areas within which we work, and our partners also work since they also contribute, which speak to strengthen institutions. And within that context, the gender bureaus and women's bureaus are identified as critical partners in governance arrangements for disaster risk at the national level. Knowledge management, which means that we're trying to build a stronger evidence base for the decisions that we're making. And this includes the critical information on the role that is played both by men and women, as indicated by the previous speaker, in supporting resilience building efforts. We also treat with sector integration, looking at mainstreaming disaster risk issues at the sectoral level. And of course, community resilience is the front line for building resilience at the national level. And as we heard from one of the previous speakers from the International Federation, the role of women at the community level through volunteerism is really critical. You will also note that there are cross-cutting themes identified within the strategy, and one of those is related to gender. So there are multiple spaces within the CDM strategy which facilitate that participation, contribution, and in keeping with the theme of this year's IDDR, contribute to disaster risk governance. I also wanted to mention the resilience framework, which was articulated in the aftermath of Hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017 at the request of the heads of government, when the critical question was asked, what does resilience mean in the context of our CARICOM states? And we worked with our partners to articulate this framework. You will note that it's built on 5 interrelated pillars. I won't go into detail on it, but if you look at the threads that are connecting the pillars, you will note that gender and inclusiveness is identified in the top left corner as well. So let's talk a little bit about some of the trailblazers, and I felt that it would be an injustice for me to make this presentation without recognizing some of the women, I think, who have inspired myself and many other young female practitioners in the field over the years, including our very own Dr. Kirby, who invited me to participate. Thank you, Dr. Kirby. And also Judy Thomas from Barbados, Charlene, who in fact has received a national honor for her contribution to disaster risk management in the Virgin Islands, and of course, Dawn French, and there are many others as well. So if we take a quick snapshot in terms of what has happened with women's participation, and I think particularly female leadership, which has already come up in the discussions, have featured over the years. historically, I checked the records with respect to the female leadership of national disaster offices. And in fact, in 13 of our 19 participating states, at some point in time, whether it is current or in the past, there has been female leadership at the national disaster offices. That's 68%, which is a very significant statistic, I think. Currently, however, there are female national disaster coordinators in 6 of the 19 participating states, or approximately 31.5% of our national disaster coordinators. And if we look specifically at the SEDEMA coordinating unit, I think this is an interesting moment in time, because at the executive management level, even though in acting capacities, both the executive director acting and the deputy executive director acting are female at this time. 53% of our professional staff, when we checked our HR profiles, are actually female. And in fact, 6 out of the 7 members of our management team, this is including executive management, or 85.7% of the management of the coordinating unit are women. In fact, the only male on our management team right now is the information and communications technology manager. So I think that is particularly interesting statistic for me. We also took a bit of a snapshot with respect to what's been happening with deployment personnel. As you know, every year we train personnel from within our participating states, and we draw on those personnel to support other states that have been impacted if they request that type of surge support. And when we looked at the statistics for the last major training that we did this was the last face-to-face training in 2018. This year we also did training, but it was online. We had 67.6% male and 31.8% female. So, and I think this is not unusual with respect to deployment statistics, because you tend to find that more males will volunteer and step forward for going into the difficult conditions in the aftermath. But more and more, we're seeing females becoming engaged, and there in the left-hand corner, in fact, is a 3-person team which we had deployed to one of our impacted states, and you would notice that all 3 of them were in fact female, and they were providing support to the Emergency Operations Center. We looked also at one of the other specialized teams, the CARICOM Disaster Relief Unit, which is a military and paramilitary group, drawn also from our participating states. And you would notice that for 2018, that we had 20.7%, or 12 of the 58 members being female, as opposed to almost 80% being male. And this is not an unusual statistic either for our CARICOM Disaster Relief Unit, and I suspect in some ways it may reflect the balance between the sexes in the military and paramilitary spaces as well. And we know, of course, that that has also been changing, albeit slowly. So if we zero in on the Barbados case study, and this information is drawn from a publication by ECA-CDM in 2016, Disaster Risk Reduction in Barbados, the Role of Parish Councils in Early Warning and Preparedness. And it revealed that with respect to community volunteerism in Barbados, that the organizations have predominantly comprised of males historically. What we're noticing is that females have become more involved over the years and have also assumed leadership roles. Specifically with respect to the timeline of the DEOs, which are the District Emergency Organizations in Barbados, the origin of these organizations is around the mid-70s, and that reflected a male domination. Towards the mid to late 1990s, there was evidence of an evolution with respect to the membership, where a change was seen and a shift from being predominantly male to increasing female numbers. And certainly within the 2000s, what we're seeing also is that women are very much more prominent. So this seems to mirror the experience of the Red Cross as indicated by our colleague from the Jamaica Red Cross. So what are some of the actions being taken to improve female involvement at the community level? Well, There are leadership courses for all district emergency organizations, and they include specialized coverage of women in decision-making processes, gender-sensitive decision-making, and conflict resolution. There's also increasing financial and other logistical resources across district emergency organizations, which are paying special attention to supporting those organizations which are led by women and the proactive councils in general. And the intent there is really to incentivize future involvement of female membership. We're also seeing enhanced agency to council communication. This is from the Department of Emergency Management to the actual councils themselves. Support through more intensive meetings and collaboration agenda to demonstrate DEM's commitment to placing more women in leadership and decision-making positions, and also peer-to-peer exposure at the level of the district emergency organizations, particularly amongst the leadership, including female leaders, to government mentors and other officials in disaster risk reduction governance. And this is intended to be a source of continued encouragement, knowledge, and experience as well. So a few observations from that snapshot. So if we look along the top bar, we notice that we see women being involved at all levels of disaster risk reduction. And I think that experience will be borne out across many of the CDEMA participating states. A critical feature has been that of female leadership, particularly leadership in spaces of influence, such as the heads of organizations, whether it be at the community or at the national level. And we've also seen that there are certain trends that have been evolving over time, where we're seeing increasing involvement of women in leadership positions. Going forward, though, there are a few things which I think we need to give some consideration to. One, consistency in the collection of sex disaggregated data. Even within the CDEMA records, if we look back to our earlier records, in terms of training statistics and also statistics on personnel for deployment, etc., we in the past did not apply that type of lens on the data related to personnel trained or who participated, etc., in workshops and that type of thing. This is now a standard feature of the work that we do, given the prominence of gender considerations within the programming of the coordinating unit, and it's going to become even more so because now we have got on board for the first time a gender specialist on the coordinating unit team, thanks to the support of the Global Affairs Canada. I also think there's space for us to have a better consideration of how we integrate gender-related consideration into the tools that we apply across the system for disaster risk reduction. The analysis of the contribution of women is something I think that's lacking in our research. And certainly this is a space for post-secondary institutions, including University of the West Indies, to place a deeper lens on so we can get a better handle on these type of issues. And I also think that there's an exciting opportunity for those trailblazers who went before me and even those of our generation to document their experiences as females within the discipline. I think there are very interesting stories that can be told. I remember walking into, for example, my first workshop that I ran as a junior officer, project officer here at CDEMA. It was a search and rescue workshop, and I, at one point in time, was the only woman in the room. And I have watched as those ratios, the ratios have changed over the years. And even though in a lot of spaces with certain aspects of the discipline, when you walk into a room, there is still very much a male dominance within the room, we're definitely getting a lot more company in terms of having females at the table, making contribution and influencing decisions on how we build resilience in our region. So thanks again for the opportunity to make this brief contribution, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Over.
Excellent. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. We've had 3 excellent contributions from Dr. Edwards, from Julie Wedderburn, and from Dr. Riley, Mrs. Riley, Executive Director of CDEMA, each highlighting the fundamental role that women have played in disaster risk reduction at the leadership level, in research, in project implementation and innovations for the development of curriculum, as well as the management of our vital resources such as the mangroves, and the need to ask probing questions and to continue to push the question of data that is disaggregated in order to facilitate the research, because obviously if the data isn't available, then you won't be able to do the in-depth work, and you'll have to start from scratch in terms of primary research activities, which would allow us to lose the history of the processes and the contributions of women in relationship to men in these vital activities. So I turned the floor open. I opened the floor for questions and comments from our participants. I just wanted to say, there was a comment from Judy. You wanted to say something?
Thank you, Pat. I want to thank Ms. Riley. You know, we sort of know about SEDIMA, but you don't really know about SEDIMA. So I'm really very interested and congratulate you for your presentation. Of course, I'm interested and very impressed that you demonstrated how women's involvement at different levels of the leadership has taken place over the years. So you're no longer the one person in the room. But I would also ask whether you would consider looking at it in even different phases. Can you discern an impact of increasing numbers of women on the kinds of policies and programs and strategies that SEDIMA itself has come up with? Are they more gender sensitive? And I think that I certainly try and look in that direction. Because, you know, the expectation is that you have more women on board now. So how are you addressing women's rights or needs or concerns equally with men's? Because if you're not explicit about it, it doesn't happen. It kind of just. So thank you so much. And I'm encouraging you to consider that when you are doing your research going forward.
Thank you so much for that question. Don't know if Mrs. Riley would like to make a quick response to that.
Yes, I can, Madam Chair. Thanks so much for that very interesting comment. And I think a very important point has been raised there, because it's one of the reasons we've got a gender specialist on board now, because we want to have a much more structured approach to how we're looking at gender-related issues in the work of the coordinating unit going forward, including that very critical aspect that you raised on how we are measuring the effectiveness of the work that we're doing from a gender perspective. So I very much appreciate the comment that was made, and certainly it is something that we're going to be taking on board as we develop the program of the gender specialists here within the team. Thank you. Madam Chair, you're muted.
Yes, my apologies. I was trying to multitask. Yes, thank you for that response and exchange between the presenters. Wanted to highlight that comments coming from the floor, from our audience. We have from the University of the West Indies Alumni Online. They're saying congratulations to the entire team for the excellent work that is being done, and we're to keep it up. And we have persons who were highlighted in this presentation, Dr. Mandel, emphasizing the importance of collaborative work in disaster risk reduction in order to maintain the gains that we have been able to achieve through that type of strategy. And of course, lots of commendations for all the presenters, lots of supporting words going out from Professor Weber, from Dr. Mandel, from Dorian Rowan Campbell, on the excellent presentations for Thera and the wonderful presentations that we had from from Judith Weatherburn. So it's been a very informative session. Everyone is very happy for the contributions that we're making, and the timely information based. Just one comment. In addition to the comments that we're getting, we don't have an immediate question, but from the comments that have come in to congratulate you all. One of the strong themes that I noticed in the presentation was highlighting the lack of recognition and despite the both formal and informal leadership that is taking place in disaster risk reduction in the several institutions, as well as in the volunteerist sector. And I was wondering whether, given that we are growing in a deeper level of political empowerment through our leadership roles, if there was something that we could do to make gender mainstreaming not simply about increasing numbers, but increasing recognition and increasing, as Judy Wedderburn put forward, and as Mrs. Riley highlighted, providing the institutional and financial support for these women who are contributing. So I was just wondering whether or not, as power brokers here in this organization, what is it that we are not doing in terms of making those recognitions being increasingly given, and support systems, both institutional and financial, for enhancing the contribution that women can play and deepening the role that they already have. So that's a general question to the panelists.
Well, I can take a first stab if you wish. It's a really thought-provoking question, and I think, well, I can speak for myself. I think that sometimes as women, we may shy away from bigging up women. So that happens sometimes. And as you were speaking, I am now reflecting, and in fact, after this, I will continue to reflect on what we can do at the SEDIMA Coordinating Unit, because the Coordinating Unit is a very important space of influence in the discipline, and I very much appreciate that. We do, for example, have an awards program at the Coordinating Unit, where awards are given against particular criteria. And I have to say, at this juncture, we do not have any specific award that seeks to recognize women's contributions, and maybe this is one of the areas that we can look at. I'm also thinking about the actions that we can take to encourage more women to come into the discipline, because one of my particular pet areas is about youth engagement. We have a youth and comprehensive disaster management program here at the Coordinating Unit, and I have to say we have not given a specific lens on how we encourage women in particular. We were more looking at engagement of the youth as a grouping, male or female, to come into the discipline. And now that I've participated in this, and I'm happy that I have, because it has stimulated me to think a bit more deeply in terms also of how we could encourage greater female participation in the discipline as well. So that for me, that's been an important takeaway. So I very much appreciate the question that you've asked, and it's certainly something that I can look at here at the Coordinating Unit. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think Judith Wedderburn from FES wanted to make a comment.
Right. Thank you, Pat. In response to your question, I start by just acknowledging that all of us here are concerned about sustainability, not in respect of what's happening to us because of climate change or response is through things like disaster risk reduction and management. And if we listen to the narrative outside of this kind of space, the hard questions are the economic questions. It's only recently, I think, when I say recently, maybe the last 10, 20 years, when in some spaces the penny has finally dropped. Hello, if we don't get this climate change thing, mitigation, adaptation, disaster risk reduction right, then our chances at sustainability are very dim. And if we look at who is involved in this kind of work, for whatever reason, just judging from today, and the younger researchers are coming up, it seems to be attracting more women. Generally speaking, don't have any research. And so it means that it's not being, this discussion is not being treated with the same seriousness outside of our space that it should be if it were a hard economic issue about increasing GDP and those kinds of things. So I think that's the dilemma we face. And so part of my job is to help people understand that all our wishes and hopes for sustainability will not go where we want it to go unless we can address that dichotomy, that divided way of looking at our lives, you know, because that's just how I'm experiencing it, and that's what my engagement with officials outside of this space is suggesting to me. We have a battle fighting. So is it growth, GDP, or is it protect the environment? That's not a choice. We don't have a choice, I don't think, of either. We have to find a way to do both. Now, who makes those decisions? That's another matter.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think that's a crucial observation being made by Judith in relationship to the focal energy on economic issues versus environmental issues. But I think that dichotomy has been blown out of the water such a long time ago. And I think perhaps the critical question, it has to do with our economic models, the models that we have for driving economic growth, which generally devalue the environment and go for short-term gains in facilitating a movement of relative improvement, but at very high cost. And another challenge in terms of the documentation for the evidence is that a lot of these costs are what we call in economics externalities that are not being measured. And so if we were to measure actually, not just trying to get gender disaggregated data, but showing how the cost differentially impact on women and men, their caregiving roles and their productive roles and their leadership roles. If we were to actually count the cost, which is we would need to have a transformation in our statistical systems of accounting, which is, I know, one of the objectives of the Sustainable Development Agenda, for a deeper form of social and environmental accounting, in which we can actually start seeing the cost and so the what seems to be profitably in one cost system, one form of measurement, is actually a loss when you take into consideration all the other factors that have been externalized and not brought into the equation. So, Thera, I'm going to allow you to make your comment as well in this panel.
Thank you, Pat. I really just wanted to go back to the whole matter of research and the point Liz made about when she first started out and how the balance has shifted. I think that happens a lot in the academic space, sometimes when you see the shift and women coming into the fore, but also as women to engage in mentoring. That's something that we don't often value, to the guidance that senior career professionals can give to junior professionals, or in academic staff working with undergraduate or postgrad students in terms of how they can influence and shape the decisions they make about career paths. and also to explore among ourselves ways to collaborate or areas of intersection for research where there can be complementary dimensions to the same problem, whether it be in a focal space or community, or just one problem looked at through different lenses based on the specializations of the persons that come together. When I was putting together my presentation, I saw that coming out and emerging, and there's a tremendous scope for more of that. And I think as a group, there's a lot that we can do to support, promote, and encourage further development in students and junior professionals through that system of mentorship and I guess guidance and collaboration in work. And of course, there's also that joining between academia and application. You know, what are we doing and how does the research we do support what SEDEMA is trying to do in a very tangible, on the ground way. So those are some of the things that crossed my mind as we were talking after this last panel.
Sorry, we have some comments coming from the floor. So I'd just like to add those comments to the conversations that we're already having on the panel. The Joan Grant Cummins makes the comment that she thinks that it's important, it's incumbent on our governments and related entities to do formal time studies on women's unpaid work and the value to the GDP. And Sophia Mitchell indicated that she's interested in efforts to mainstream gender responsive actions in social protection initiatives in disasters in the Caribbean. And I think that also comes back to one of the very first questions that was raised by a contributor to Dr. Lam about the importance of integrating in our research curriculum this vital area of warehousing and relief efforts in post-disaster situations. So we need to make sure that we bring on board these vital lenses to add to our capacity to effectively respond in post-disaster situations. Again, another comment from Joan Grant Cummins, is I think she's encouraging us and the Red Cross in terms of the examples that were provided and to concretize how it is that we need to mobilize additional resources for disaster risk management. So I wanted to open the floor amongst the presenters again for any final words or comments before we draw this session to a close from our team that we have had, which would include the earlier presenters, if they're still here with us. I know I received an apology from Dr. Lam, who had to leave, but I'd like to open the floor for any final thoughts or words, very briefly, in a few seconds, from our main presenters who are present with us still, Professor Spence, Mrs. Hugh, and Miss Bernard. So the floor is open for final comments and final comments from our presenters, and then we'll wrap up.
May I go?
So, Professor Spence?
Yes. I've been sitting here and my mind has been going a mile a minute since Ms. Wedderburn's presentation. And something that struck me was a comment, I think, that referred to the multiple role of women, the care role plus the other role that they're engaged in. And the thought that how much more time women would have in these productive, to contribute to these productive sphere where they assisted with the care role that they're engaged in. In other words, you know, if they were to get paid help to deal with the care aspect of it. Am I summarizing right, Ms. Wedderburn?
Judy?
Yes, I'm here. I did something wrong. Are you hearing me?
Yeah, I'm hearing you.
We're
Yes,
hearing you.
Professor Spencer, that's correct.
Okay.
What-
My question though is, what would women's perceptions be of getting paid help to deal with the care aspect of it? Is it something that they would find accepting in your mind, especially in the context of the importance of that care aspect as a contributor to the other economic aspect of what women do?
Okay.
Very important question. Judy, you want to comment?
First of all, I certainly, the persons with whom I work in my space acknowledge that there are women that want to do it and will do it. That's not the issue. And there are women who can afford to pay somebody to take care of their children or share the cost of the caring. Or if they're really fortunate, they have a father in the house who is willing to share the responsibilities. Because ideally, the children would benefit the most from that. But that's not how life is in many households. So how would women feel? I would not venture to say all women would prefer not to have to do it. What I would hazard a guess to say is that most women would like some support so that their own time, some of their time, they could then choose to contribute more in whatever field they're qualified to do without suffering from burnout, basically. The other thing too is, the question now is, who is to pay? Who is to pay for this child support? Is it the state? If she's earning money, does she take it out of her money? If there's a father, it's quite complicated and worthy of far more discussion. The other issue too is, how do we value it? That is why it requires an additional conversation about what is that care work actually contributing to the capacity of almost all sectors to function. And then those sectors are the ones whose contribution you measure in the national income indicators, that they have contributed this percent and that percent, when they would not have been able to do that if at the foundation there were hundreds of thousands of women doing the care work for almost no pay. So those are the kinds of very in-depth discussions that need to be held, not just technically, but also ideologically, because there's some people are adamant who will say, no, that's women's work, they must do it. Well, I think times are changing a little, and there are more women who would like to feel, yes, we'll do it, but you need to respect us and respect the value of what it is we are doing. I don't know if that helps, Professor Spencer.
That's an excellent comment, and I just wanted to reinforce that a recent Capri study on the care economy in Jamaica emphasized that very point about the need to support the care economy and for the removal of the types of the undervaluation of individuals who are involved in the care economy as a fundamental prerequisite towards increasing productivity in all spheres of the economic activity and for the improvement of the capacities of a country to build its social capital, to build its social development, to ensure effective social systems that we need in order to be resilient to risk and to manage some of the challenges and shocks that we face. So there's empirical work that's being done on the care economy, which certainly emphasizes the importance of a proper valuation and a proper policy towards individuals who are involved in that, from our health service personnel to our persons who are involved in household work, to enhance their capacities to reproduce themselves and have better livelihoods. So I just...
Pat, can I make one last comment? I promise I won't be long.
Sure, of course.
Dr. Edwards, you showed us that beautiful map, had 4 sections about where some houses and a tree was, I don't know how many 100 years ago, where it is now. It just occurred to me, in terms of the collaboration that I think you spoke about, of persons in your field and outside of your particular field. This is really exciting research. If we could just visualize putting another layer of research, I don't know how you would do it, to understand what has happened to the household and communities who used to live in those areas. How do we prevent, how do we measure the damage if that condition continues to expand along that coast? We know it's happening all over the North Coast and parts of the South Coast. How do we measure that using your scientific data research to demonstrate that it is really happening? Because there's some people that will tell you, no, that's just nature, time passes, but we know that that's not why you're doing it.
It's quite interesting because the research actually started off as a nice little Jamaica Journal discussive piece on what used to be called the Paris of the West Indies. It was a vibrant coastal town. And even after the demise of the main plantation and the settlers moving out, there was still money musk happening nearby. And in the whole sugar era, you had coastal shipping coming into Carlisle Port. So there was a lot of activity, settlement. There was a free village in the area. So that part of the narrative we've actually done as well. And what I was just showing was how that narrative of place and people actually led to climate and change and shorelines and erosion and took on another application. So that is there. And it's very interesting because I've talked about that with colleagues about these vulnerable coastal communities all around Jamaica, and it could be any Caribbean island or a small island developing state, and what's happening to them over time. And to just move it not only out of the science, but into a narrative of people and the places they occupied and what that means on a social level.
Right, thank you very much. That's very encouraging. I love it.
Thank you so much. That today's forum has been a feast in terms of a highlighting of the different issues that affect women in disaster risk reduction, but also in terms of the contribution that women have been making from the ground to the boardroom, to management leadership positions that are occupied, as Ms. Riley highlighted, 80% of those positions are supported by women in leadership. And increasingly at the management level, sorry, not 80 odd, 68% of female leadership in national disaster offices, and increasingly women participating in disaster coordination release, and in terms of the management profile within these organizations for disaster coordination and relief, up to 85% of the current management structure is are women, although in terms of the deployment of people on the ground in post-disaster situations, emergency management situations, the weight shifts to men, largely because they're taking on more challenging physical circumstances of engagement, with 70% of those in the deployment staff being men and 31% being women. So there are very interesting statistics that emphasize the foundational leadership role that women have been playing at the top, but also in management and also at the level of ground support from volunteerism, as we saw in the Red Cross presentation from Mrs. Hugh, but also in the knowledge institutions such as the University of West Indies, where Thera emphasized the work being produced by 6 sterling researchers, herself, Dr. Mandel, Dr. Lester, Dr. Smith, Professor Weber, and Mrs. Marcia Query Ford. So these are fundamental examples of the work in knowledge production, in leadership, but also in terms of managing the capacities to have sustainable systems in agriculture, where Professor Spence emphasized the work of women in preserving agricultural biodiversity, in being the front line for getting youth involved in agriculture through backyard gardens. Their preponderance in maintaining the food security by being involved in small-scale agricultural production. So while it is that they may not be given the same level of income because of their activities, they're playing fundamental roles in supporting agroecological systems, in supporting intergenerational knowledge transfer, and in ensuring that there is capacity to respond to shocks, in providing food security, in enabling this process of contribution. But it's not a completely positive picture, because we also saw that women have differential risk in terms of the impact of disaster, whereas Ms. Bernard highlighted that there was a higher mortality for women in the case of disasters. And she gave a couple of examples with the impact of hurricanes, and in the case of the Riverton City of Jamaica, example of a fire hazard that disproportionately impacts on women. And also, as Ms. Sweddenburn highlighted, in post-disaster situations, we see that men tend to get a higher percentage of physical injuries, but women tend to be exposed in post-disaster situations to social vulnerabilities. So issues in terms of higher exposure to violence from contexts of anxiety, contexts of increased economic vulnerability that is being faced by these women in their households and in their communities. So there are different kinds of violence which are being experienced, which emphasizes the importance of being able to look at the kinds of lived experiences that are there and how it is that it shapes both the contributions that women make, but also some of the risk that they face and the hazards of the differential impact of the negative shocks from these hazards that realize themselves in the profile described by the many presenters on the burdens that are being borne by women in the communities. So I think the first presenter gave us a very good start, Dr. Lam, and I think the themes that she raised in her first presentation actually ran through all the contributors in terms of the need for an increase in awareness and to resolve some of these misperceptions that exist about disaster reduction, but also the misperceptions as to the differential roles that women and men play in disaster risk reduction. She emphasized the need for more training and development. But also in the same breath, the need for appropriate technology. And finally, she called for a transdisciplinary approach that would allow us to have a greater degree of cooperation and synergies across our intellectual frameworks. And I think, especially in the last panel, that was a very strong appeal to avoid the dichotomies between the economy and the environment, to avoid the fragmentation of research, but to build the cross collaborations in our different areas of specialization, because the picture is a holistic one, impacts are holistic, and the research needs to be holistic. So I think one very important takeaway from this forum is that women who tend to understand the relational dynamics of building community, building up from the household up to the highest echelons of leadership in institutions, that these cooperative skills and values that are carried out routinely by women need to be embedded in our research and in our practices for engaging in disaster management, reduction, and management. So I just wanted to congratulate everyone for the very timely and important presentations made, highlighting the different types of information that is necessary for us to move forward. And I would really want to encourage Dr. Kirby to use this opportunity to see how this information could be contained in some sort of publication and or project around recording these particular types of experiences of the role of women and their contribution to disaster risk reduction, so that we have something that is less ephemeral, that is going to be a foundation for perhaps the mentorship work that was emphasized by Dr. Edwards, that can show what the trailblazing contributions women have made in disaster risk reduction, and how important it is for us to give equal value for the critical work that is being done in this sector by women. So thank you all, for audience, for your comments, for your questions, for your kudos, your big up to the various presenters as they were making their presentations. Thanking all of you for your time and patience in participating in this forum. And I'd like to now turn over the discussions and the wrap-up for our presentations today, celebrating women on this International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. And I hope that you all, wherever you are, remain safe and have a wonderful afternoon. Barbara, over to you.
Thank you, Pat. Before I go into the thank yous, I just want to follow up on a couple of points from the discussions. Somebody had asked about warehouse and relief supplies management training, just to indicate that CDMA does do that type of training in terms of supporting operations in its participating states. So I'm not sure where that person was from, but CDMA could give them more information on that warehouse and relief supplies management training. Balfour raised the point about women influencing and forming the next generation of small farmers. And it reminded me that many years ago, I lived in the country, and there was a young man that worked with us. And where I saw weeds, he was pointing out medicinal plants. So I would think it is a weed, and he would say, no, that is good for so-and-so, whatever the illness was or the wellness was. And he had actually gained that knowledge from his grandmother. So there we have an important role of women in terms of women being the guardians of indigenous knowledge. And there again, I think that is something which is underappreciated widely, generally speaking, but also for disaster risk management. So that is another potential area of research, I think, that we could be looking at. I think it was Sarah who asked the question, how can research better support practice? Just to say that co-designing of research is now really the way to go, certainly for disaster risk reduction. There is much of that taking place. So this is where everybody sits together and comes up with everything, including the questions which should be asked, the methodologies for answering those questions, and then, of course, the whole thing about knowledge sharing at the end. So co-designing of research, I think, is an area in which I'm very interested in, and that is something perhaps that we could look at going forward. So we have come to the end of our discussions. I think our panelists have shown how truly multidisciplinary disaster risk management, disaster risk reduction are. It emphasizes to me the fact that if risk reduction is to be really successful, we need not only transdisciplinary methodologies and approaches, but we also need a whole of society involvement. We have seen that DRM, disaster risk management, is also very vertically integrated. And across that entire vertical spectrum, it is important that everybody should participate. So the whole of society approach is very relevant here. But I hope everybody enjoyed the discussions and presentations as much as I did. We will try to make them available, perhaps through the DRRC website. Let me thank our moderator for so ably managing the afternoon and guiding us through the program, Pat. Our panelists, who willingly provided their support to the event, despite what I know are their very busy and packed schedules. The Mona Information and Technology Services Unit allowed us to reach a global audience. So thanks to Ishmael Preston and his team at MITS. Nadine Sherlock of the Institute for Sustainable Development has provided invaluable support in pulling all of this together. And we also had Simone Lee, who was responsible for monitoring the chat and ensuring that the questions and comments were passed to the moderator. So thanks, Nadine and Simone. And finally, thank you, our audience, for joining us today and for your enthusiastic participation. Stay safe, everyone.